Monday morning, at 8 a.m., in the Alarico high-rise, did not begin casual office banter. It began with the heavy, pneumatic hiss of the private elevator doors, sealing me into the 64th floor, the sterile scent of ozone from the servers, mixing with the lingering polish on the mahogany wainscoting. I stepped out onto the imported silk rug, the damp chill of the Boston autumn clinging to my cheap olive-green trench coat. My spine ached, a physical manifestation of a weekend spent navigating the suffocating labyrinth of medical billing and collections agencies. I walked to my desk, a massive, imposing slab of dark wood positioned precisely outside the double doors of Dante Alarico's inner sanctum. At 28, my title was executive secretary, but my actual utility to the syndicate was buried in the encrypted hard drives, currently booting up in front of me. I was a forensic accountant. I cleaned up the financial blood splatter of a violent empire. The discrepancy on the ledgers was small, a mere 3% variance in the shipping logistics column. But to a mind trained to hunt missing numbers, it screamed like a siren in a silent room. Before I could even log into the secure intranet, my phone vibrated in my purse. The short, sharp buzz was a somatic trigger. My heart rate kicked up a notch, my stomach dropping into a familiar icy abyss. I pulled the device out, the screen illuminating my pale, exhausted face. Victor. I know exactly where you work now, Clara. We need to talk about the debt. I still have the proxy paperwork for your mother's care. Do not ignore me. The sheer, cowardly vindictiveness of the man made my chest physically tight. Victor Cross was not a physical threat. He was a parasite who operated in the shadows of legal loopholes and emotional manipulation. 2 years ago, he had siphoned every dime from our joint accounts to feed his escalating gambling addiction, leaving me drowning in his wake. Now he was using my mother's fragile state at the specialized medical facility as leverage to extort the meager survival funds I had managed to scrape together. He knew Martha Mercer represented my absolute vulnerability. I shoved the phone face down into the bottom of my bag, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unclasp my coat. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe in the sterile, filtered air of the high-rise. I had to be perfect today. In Dante Alarico's world, weakness was a liability, and I refused to be a liability. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the heavy doors to the penthouse suite opened. Dante did not merely walk into a room. He commanded the atmospheric pressure within it. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, the jacket unbuttoned, exuding an aura of calculated predatory stillness. He paused by my desk, his cold slate-gray eyes sweeping over my rigid posture, noting the dark circles I had not quite managed to hide with heavy concealer. "You are breathing too shallowly, Clara," he murmured, his gravelly baritone vibrating against my ribs. "And your coat is still damp. Hang it up before the cold sets into your bones." "Yes, sir. Good morning, Mr. Alarico," I managed to say, my voice clinically detached. He lingered for a fraction of a second longer than a normal employer would, his gaze dropping to the slight tremor in my fingers, before he turned and walked into his office. That was the terrifying dichotomy of working for the most dangerous man in Massachusetts. He noticed everything, and I was terrified of the day he finally noticed the real reason I was bleeding myself dry. The grueling pace of the week offered no reprieve, a relentless tide of offshore routing numbers and dummy corporations that demanded absolute precision. By Wednesday evening at 6:30 p.m., the exhaustion had calcified into a dangerous kind of hyper-focus. I worked methodically, finding comfort in the familiar motions of data parsing and cross-referencing. The financial data on my dual monitors displayed a variance of exactly 3% in the Alarico shipping logistics column. It was a calculated anomaly, an expertly buried routing error that would have slipped past any standard corporate audit. Without a second glance, I cross-referenced the encrypted digital figures on my screen with the heavy pages of the black leather ledger sitting open on my mahogany desk. The tactile scrape of my pen against the thick parchment grounded me. In the dead, heavily insulated silence of the executive level, that discrepancy was a blaring alarm. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes burning from the unbroken hours of intense analysis, tracking the missing capital through 4 layers of offshore shell companies. The numbers told a story. They always did. $214,000. Rerouted, misclassified as fuel surcharges, and effectively vanished from the Boston shipping manifests. It took me a grueling amount of time to trace the digital footprints through dummy corporations in the Caymans back to an overseas holding account. I highlighted the cell, my fingers moving across the mechanical keyboard with practiced efficiency. I found the leaks. I plugged the holes. I analyzed the financial intricacies of a massive, violent empire without ever asking where the bodies were buried. It was a skill set forged in the fires of my own financial ruin. Back when I had to track every stolen dime Victor had siphoned from me. Now I used that same hypervigilance to protect Dante. A sharp cramp radiated through my right shoulder, settling back onto the muscle like a familiar suffocating weight. I reached up, massaging the stiff joint, and that was when the temperature in the room inexplicably dropped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a sudden, somatic spike of hypervigilance. I did not hear the heavy mahogany doors open. I did not hear footsteps on the imported silk rug, but I knew I was no longer alone. My body reacted before my brain could process the shift, an instinctual, somatic response to a sudden apex threat. I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse. The ambient scent of the office was suddenly overwhelmed by the sharp, undeniable fragrance of winter cedar, expensive leather, and the faint, coppery tang of violence that never completely washed off his skin. "You are still working." His voice bypassed my ears entirely. It was not a question. It was an observation, heavy with an undercurrent of displeasure, that made my pulse kick up a terrifying notch. I swallowed the dry thickness in my throat, forcing my spine completely straight before turning my chair to face him. Dante stood near the shadows of the floor-to-soiling windows, the violent winter storm battering the reinforced glass behind him, forming a chaotic backdrop to his absolute stillness. The heavy platinum Alarico signet ring caught the dim light of my desk lamp as he rested one hand over the other. He was not looking at my monitors. He was looking at me, his gaze, a cold, predatory gray that missed absolutely nothing, tracked my pale complexion, the faint shaking of my hands, and the way my cheap blouse clung to my rigid posture. "The quarterly logistics required immediate reconciliation, sir," I said, keeping my voice clinically detached, a necessary armor in his presence. There was a discrepancy in the waterfront holdings. I have isolated the source and prepared the report for your review. It was exactly 3% carefully hidden in the margins. It took me until 6:30 p.m. to crack the final encryption layer. I did not ask about the waterfront holdings, Clara. He stepped out of the shadows, his movements fluid and completely silent for a man of his size. The distance between us closed in 3 strides, forcing me to tilt my head up to maintain eye contact. My lungs constricted. The proximity was a suffocating blanket, heavy and intoxicating. I could see the faint shadow of exhaustion along his own jawline, the taut coiling of muscles beneath his shirt that marked him as an elegant dinner companion to something far more dangerous. "It is past normal operating hours," Dante stated, coming to a halt just inches from the edge of my desk. He reached out, his large, scarred hand brushing past my coffee mug to firmly close the lid of my primary laptop. The screen went black. He then rested his fingers briefly against the cover of the black leather ledger, a silent acknowledgement of my work, before his gaze snapped back to my face. "I do not pay you to bleed yourself dry over a spreadsheet. I am merely doing my job," I replied, fighting the urge to lean away from his overpowering warmth. "The Alarico accounts are complex. If I do not maintain the ledger, if you do not maintain the ledger, I hire an entire firm to do it." He interrupted smoothly, his voice dropping an octave. "You are exhausted, you are shivering, and you are hiding something." My heart hammered against my sternum. I kept my face blank, a defense mechanism honed over years of surviving men who wanted to break me. He did not know. He could not know about Victor. Deep inside the encrypted vault of my phone, currently buried in my purse, sat the reality of my nightmare. Victor's texts were simple, brutal extortion. Demands for money backed by threats to contact the hospital administration and redirect my mother's medical care, using his lingering legal loopholes. Victor was a coward who built his fragile ego by crushing my self-esteem, leaving me with marks like a necklace I never asked for, and crippling debt. I had spent the last 2 years climbing out of the crater he left behind, weaponizing my intellect just to survive. I was not going to let him drag me back into the dark, but the sheer terror of his threats, combined with the reality of my mother's failing health, was a physical weight pressing against my chest. "I am fine, Mr. Alarico," I lied smoothly, just focused. Dante's eyes narrowed, a glacial shift that warned me he saw straight through the deception. His steely gaze dropped to my collarbone, then to my wrists, searching for the invisible wounds he somehow always sensed. In my world, when an employer noticed your exhaustion, it was a prelude to termination. In his world, I was not entirely sure what it meant, but the possessive, territorial edge in his stare made my breath catch. "You are a terrible liar, Clara," he murmured, his tone softer now, almost dangerously gentle. "But we will leave it for tonight. Go home. My driver is waiting for you downstairs." "I can take the subway," I protested instinctively, grabbing my purse. "It is really not necessary. Not a request, a directive." Dante's expression hardened into an impenetrable mask of authority. "You do not walk alone in the rain, not while you belong to my office. Understood?" I nodded once, sharply. "Yes, sir." I practically fled the penthouse, the heat of his gaze burning a hole between my shoulder blades, until the heavy doors finally sealed behind me. The private elevator descended 60 floors in absolute silence, depositing me into the subterranean parking garage of the Alarico building. The air down here was vastly different from the penthouse. Concrete and exhaust fumes replaced the rich scent of cedar and leather, settling over my skin in a damp, chilly layer. I pulled my thin coat tighter around my shoulders, shivering as the adrenaline of my encounter with Dante began to drain, leaving nothing but bone-deep exhaustion. A sleek, armored black SUV idled near the private exit, its headlights cutting through the gloom. As I approached, the driver's side door opened. Silas Thorne stepped out. He was a mountain of a man, Dante's personal driver and primary enforcer. Silas was a ghost wrapped in tactical gear, a man who possessed the terrifying ability to blend into the shadows despite his massive, muscular frame. He rarely spoke, operating entirely on silent nods and lethal efficiency. He opened the rear passenger door for me without a word. "Thank you, Silas," I murmured, sliding into the back. The interior of the vehicle was a sanctuary. The heavy, bulletproof doors shut, with a vacuum-sealed thud that instantly muted the low rumble of the garage. The heated leather seats began to immediately thaw the chill from my spine. I leaned my head against the tinted glass, watching the rain-slicked streets of Boston blur past as we emerged into the violent storm. I expected the usual silence, the comforting, uncomplicated quiet that Silas always provided. But tonight, as we merged onto the highway, his deep, gravel-laced voice broke the stillness. "The hospital, Clara?" he asked, his eyes briefly meeting mine in the rearview mirror. "Yes, please," I said, surprised he remembered my routine. Or perhaps I should not be. The Alarico Syndicate knew everything. "He watches you," Silas stated flatly. It was not a casual observation, it was a tactical report. I stiffened, my fingers tightening around the strap of my purse. Mr. Alarico is a detail-oriented man. He monitors all his employees. Not like this. Silas merged smoothly into the fast lane, the heavy armored chassis of the SUV completely ignoring the hydroplaning risks of the torrential rain. "I have driven for him for 9 years. I have seen him fire executives for blinking too slowly. I have seen him dismantle entire rival crews over a single perceived insult. He does not concern himself with the sleep schedules of his administrative staff." "I am his forensic accountant," I corrected, a defensive edge creeping into my voice. "My cognitive function directly impacts his bottom line." Silas let out a low, humorless sound. "Do not confuse your professional utility with his personal obsession, Clara. Dante Alarico does not share. When he claims something as his, whether it is a territory, a business, or a person, he builds a gilded cage around it. He protects it absolutely. But he also ensures it can never leave." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "I am an employee, Silas, nothing more." "For your sake, I hope that remains true," Silas replied, his tone grim. "Because if he finds out whatever it is you are hiding from him, he will not just solve the problem. He will burn the surrounding city to the ground to ensure it never touches you again. And you will be standing in the center of the ash, belonging entirely to him." I did not answer. I could not. I simply stared out the reinforced window, the heavy rain masking the sudden, terrifying realization that Silas was absolutely right. 20 minutes later, the SUV pulled into the circular driveway of St. Jude's private wing. The building was an imposing fortress of clinical efficiency, all sharp lines and sterile lights, contrasting sharply with the dark, violent underworld I had just left. It was the only place equipped to handle Martha's specific autoimmune deterioration, a fact Victor knew perfectly well. "I can wait," Silas offered, shifting the vehicle into park. "No thank you. I will be a while. I will catch a cab from the clinic stand." He did not argue, simply nodding as I stepped out into the freezing downpour and hurried through the sliding glass doors. The transition from the violent storm to the hyper-sterile environment of the intensive care floor was jarring. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic and bleached linen. The rhythmic, electronic hum of telemetry monitors formed a steady baseline of anxiety. I walked down the quiet corridor to room 412, my footsteps muffled by the commercial carpeting. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. Martha Mercer lay in the center of the bed, looking impossibly small. The stark white clinical sheets seemed to swallow her frail frame. Her skin was the color of old translucent parchment, mapped with the faint blue lines of fragile veins. A complex array of IV tubes snaked from a tall metal pole into her arm, delivering the expensive cocktail of experimental drugs, keeping her aggressive autoimmune disease at bay. I walked over to the chair beside her bed and sat down heavily, dropping my purse onto the linoleum floor. I reached out, taking her cold, frail hand in my own. She did not stir, her breathing shallow but steady under the influence of the sedatives. My analytical brain, the forensic accountant that never truly clocked out, instantly began to calculate. $2,450 a day for this isolated room. $820 for the specialized respiratory therapy. $4,700 a week for the immunosuppressant infusion protocol. It was a crushing, suffocating mountain of debt that I carried entirely alone. A mountain that currently stood at just over $89,000, growing heavier with every breath she took. Children are targets, liabilities. Anyone in my position knows better than to give the world that kind of leverage. But she was my mother. She was the only family I had left, the only person who had ever loved me without a transactional motive. I would forge 1,000 ledgers. I would work under the predatory gaze of Dante Alarico for 100 lifetimes, just to keep her lungs drawing air. I glanced at the medical chart hanging at the foot of the bed. Old habits died hard. I scanned the nurse's notations, my eyes instantly catching a discrepancy. The dosage for her pain medication had been logged at 50 milligrams, but the IV drip rate was set for a 15 milligrams delivery per hour. I stood up immediately, pressing the call button. When the night nurse hurried in, I clinically pointed out the error, my voice calm, polite, but backed by a core of absolute unyielding steel. The half-life of this specific synthetic opiate requires a steady 50 milligram infusion to prevent breakthrough pain, I explained, tapping the digital monitor. A 15 milligrams drip rate will cause her system to crash into withdrawal symptoms by 4 a.m. Adjust the parameters immediately. The nurse apologized profusely, her face pale as she reprogrammed the digital interface. "Thank you, Clara," she stammered, avoiding my gaze as she adjusted the lines. "You caught that very quickly." "I deal with numbers for a living," I replied quietly. Small mistakes usually hide massive consequences. When the nurse left, I sank back into the chair, the last remaining reserves of my energy bleeding out onto the sterile floor. I pulled my phone from my purse, the screen illuminating my exhausted face. The notification icon mocked me. 3 new messages from Victor. I opened the thread. "I know about the intensive medical care, Clara. 10 grand within 48 hours, or I call the hospital administration and claim legal proxy. You know the paperwork is still a mess. Do not test me." My hand shook, the screen blurring. The sheer, cowardly vindictiveness of the man made me sick. Victor was not stealing the silverware. He was not raiding the liquor cabinet for vintage scotch. He was stealing the last remnants of my sanity. He knew my legal guardianship was tied up in probate court because of the massive debt he had originally dumped on me. He was weaponizing the one thing I loved just to squeeze me for cash. I locked the screen, dropping the phone into my lap. I was caught between 2 absolute extremes. Not a choice between good and evil, but a choice between 2 different types of destruction. Victor Cross, a weak, manipulative abuser who used the legal system to bleed me dry, and Dante Alarico, a terrifying apex predator who offered absolute protection at the cost of complete possession. If I gave Dante the truth, if I showed him this text, he would not just pay the debt. He would eliminate Victor entirely. But in doing so, I would step into a cage I could never leave. I squeezed my eyes shut, listening to the steady beep of my mother's heart monitor, and prayed that the fragile walls I had built around my life would hold for just 1 more week. Thursday arrived with the suffocating pressure of a ticking clock. My mother's specialized treatments were accumulating charges, and Victor's deadline was burning a hole in my pocket. I arrived at the top floor at 7:45 a.m., burying my panic beneath layers of professional detachment. The penthouse office operated with its usual terrifying efficiency. Dante was in closed-door meetings for most of the afternoon, with various capos from the Alarico syndicate. The muffled sounds of heated Italian arguments, occasionally bleeding through the heavy mahogany. I kept my head down, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard, as I audited the offshore shell accounts, making sure the 3% variance was permanently erased from the operational ledger. By 10:15 p.m., the storm that had been threatening the city all week finally broke over Boston in a torrential downpour. The high-rise windows rattled under the force of the wind, the heavy rain blurring the city lights into abstract streaks of neon. I was alone at my desk, packing my bag with movements that felt sluggish and heavy with dread. Every time my phone screen lit up, my heart seized, anticipating another threat from Victor. The elevator chimed, the airtight doors sliding open. I looked up, expecting Silas or perhaps one of the night guards. Instead, Julian Sterling stepped out. Julian was Dante's trusted childhood friend and the syndicate's underboss. He moved with a charismatic, predatory grace that completely contradicted the brutal efficiency he was known for. Where Dante was cold, calculated stillness, Julian was all sharp smiles and observant eyes. He wore an expensive bespoke suit that perfectly tailored his athletic frame, but his true danger lay in how deeply he understood the psychological mechanics of the people around him. "Still here, Clara?" Julian asked, his voice smooth and entirely too perceptive as he strolled toward my desk. "The boss is going to start charging you rent if you keep practically living on level 64. I was just leaving, Mr. Sterling," I replied, standing up and reaching for my cheap olive green trench coat. The quarterly reconciliation took longer than anticipated. Julian paused, his sharp gaze lingering on my thin coat, then sweeping over my pale, exhausted features. He noticed the nervous quiver running through my knuckles, the physical manifestation of Victor's looming deadline. Unlike Dante, who watched me with a possessive, consuming intensity, Julian watched me with the calculating eyes of a man orchestrating a very specific outcome. "You cannot walk out into that storm wearing a piece of fabric thinner than a napkin," Julian observed mildly. He glanced toward the closed double doors of Dante's inner sanctum. A slow, knowing smile curved his lips. It was the expression of a man who was about to deliberately strike a match in a room full of gasoline. Before I could protest, Julian reached over a nearby leather armchair, picking up an exquisite, heavy emerald velvet coat. It was a garment clearly meant for a high society charity gala, the thick, luxurious fabric practically radiating warmth and wealth. "Put this on," Julian instructed, holding the heavy coat out to me. "It was left in one of the private suites downstairs by a careless associate. It will serve you far better than whatever that olive tragedy is." "I cannot accept this, Mr. Sterling," I said, stepping back. "It is incredibly expensive. My own coat is perfectly fine." "Clara," Julian said, his tone dropping the casual charm, replacing it with a firm, immovable authority. "You are freezing. You are exhausted, and I am not asking. Consider it a mandatory uniform upgrade. Besides, I am heading to the ground floor. I will walk you to your car." "I take the subway," I corrected quietly. Julian's eyes flashed with something unreadable. "Not tonight, you do not. I am driving you home. The storm is flooding the lower transit lines, and I refuse to let the syndicate's best forensic accountant drown in a subway terminal." He stepped into my personal space, not with the overwhelming, possessive gravity of Dante, but with a smooth, decisive action. He draped the heavy emerald velvet coat over my shoulders. The sheer weight and warmth of the garment enveloped me instantly, the luxurious velvet a stark, jarring contrast to my reality. "Come," Julian said, placing a gentle, guiding hand against the small of my back, a touch that was strictly platonic yet deliberately visible. "Let us get you out of here." I was too exhausted to fight him. I gathered my purse, the emerald coat swamping my frame but providing a desperate, much-needed layer of security against the cold. We walked toward the private elevator. The doors slid open, and just as we stepped inside, my gaze involuntarily flicked back toward the penthouse. The double doors to the inner sanctum had opened. Dante Alarico stood in the threshold. The absolute, terrifying stillness of the mafia boss was entirely gone. Dante's posture was rigid, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. His storm-colored irises were locked directly onto me, specifically, onto the expensive emerald velvet coat wrapping my body, and the position of Julian's hand hovering near my waist. It was a violent, barely contained explosion of primal jealousy. His jaw clenched so hard I thought the bone would snap. The thick band of polished metal gleamed under the overhead lights as his hands curled into tight, lethal fists at his sides. I stopped breathing. The elevator doors began to slide shut, cutting off his line of sight, but the sheer predatory fury in his expression was seared into my retinas. "Julian," I whispered, panic spiking sharply in my chest as the elevator descended. He saw us, Mr. Alarico. He looked furious. Julian leaned back against the polished steel wall of the elevator, crossing his arms over his chest. That same calculated, knowing smile returned to his face. Yes, he did. Why would you do that? I asked, my voice trembling. He does not tolerate insubordination or perceived disrespect. You just deliberately provoked him. Clara. Julian said softly, his observant eyes locking onto mine. Dante has been pacing that penthouse like a caged animal for 6 months, bleeding his own restraint dry just to keep from terrifying you. Sometimes, a man needs a very specific push to realize that his patience is actually a liability. He needed to see you walking away with someone else to understand exactly what he stands to lose. I am just his secretary, I argued, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. You are the woman wearing my emerald coat, Julian corrected smoothly, and by the time we reach the ground floor, Dante will have torn this building apart to get to you. The elevator chimed, the doors opening to the subterranean parking garage. The air was thick with exhaust and the distant rumble of thunder. Julian placed his hand on the small of my back again, guiding me toward his sleek silver sports car. We did not make it 10 feet. The screech of heavy, armored tires echoed violently through the concrete garage. A massive black armored SUV, Dante's personal vehicle, barreled around the concrete pillar, slamming to a halt directly in our path. The tires smoked against the wet pavement, the headlights blinding us in the gloom. The driver's side door was kicked open with enough force to dent the hinges. Dante stepped out into the harsh garage lighting. He had bypassed Silas completely. He was driving himself, and he looked like a man who had come to collect a soul. The bespoke charcoal suit jacket was gone, his dark dress shirt pulled tight across his chest, the sleeves rolled up to expose the violent ink of his syndicate tattoos. He did not look at Julian. His eyes, a terrifying, consuming storm of gray, were fixed entirely on me. Take the coat off, Dante ordered. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, lethal vibration that echoed off the concrete walls, commanding absolute obedience. I froze, my hands instinctively clutching the lapels of the emerald velvet. Mr. Alarico, I said, take it off. Dante closed the distance between us in 3 massive strides. The sheer gravitational pull of his fury was suffocating. He stopped mere inches from me, his presence a dark, overwhelming eclipse. He reached out, his scarred hands gripping the heavy velvet material of the coat. He did not wait for my compliance. With a swift, forceful motion that was utterly lacking in his usual restraint, he stripped the emerald velvet coat from my shoulders. The cold air of the garage bit into my thin blouse, but I could not feel it. All I could feel was the chaotic, possessive heat radiating from his body. Dante tossed the expensive garment onto the damp concrete floor like it was garbage. You do not wear his clothes, Dante snarled, his chest heaving, his gaze dropping to my lips before locking onto my eyes. You do not leave with him. You do not belong in his car. Dante, Julian interjected, his tone mild, completely unbothered by the homicidal aura radiating from his oldest friend. She was freezing. I was simply offering her a ride home in the storm. You will walk back upstairs, Julian, Dante said, his voice dropping into a deadly, quiet register that promised immediate violence. Before I forget that I have known you since we were children. Julian raised his hands in mock surrender, a satisfied gleam in his eye. Have a good night, Clara, he called out lightly, before turning and strolling back toward the private elevator, leaving me entirely alone with the apex predator he had just unchained. I stood frozen on the concrete, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had spent months navigating the professional boundaries of the Alarico syndicate, relying on Dante's cold, calculated restraint. That restraint was now completely shattered. Dante reached out, his large, calloused fingers wrapping firmly around my wrist. The touch was not brutal, but it was absolute. An unbreakable iron shackle. Get in the car, he commanded softly, the possessive territorial edge in his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Mr. Alarico, my apartment is. You are not going to your apartment. Dante pulled me firmly toward the open passenger door of the armored SUV, his grip on my wrist burning like a brand against my skin. You are finished hiding from me, Clara. Tonight I expose every single secret you are keeping in the dark. My breath caught in my throat. The panic that had been simmering in my veins all week finally boiled over. Victor, the medical debt, the extortion. Dante was going to tear all of my carefully constructed defenses to the ground. He practically lifted me into the passenger seat, slamming the heavy, bulletproof door shut behind me. The airtight thud sealed my fate. The mafia boss had seen me leave with his best friend, and his jealousy had just triggered the total collapse of my world. Inside the cabin, the ambient, echoing noise of the subterranean parking garage was instantly neutralized, replaced instead by the suffocating, highly pressurized silence of Dante Alarico's absolute control. I pressed my flush against the heated leather seat, my breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts that I could not regulate. The thin, damp fabric of my olive green blouse clung to my shivering skin, entirely inadequate against the chill that had already settled deep into my bones. But the physical cold was secondary, entirely eclipsed by the sheer, overwhelming proximity of the man sitting rigidly in the driver's seat. He did not speak, he did not yell. The head of the Alarico syndicate did not need volume to project violence. He simply shifted the massive vehicle into gear, the heavily modified V8 engine roaring to life beneath us, like a caged beast suddenly off its leash, and slammed his expensive leather shoe onto the accelerator. We shot out of the parking structure and into the torrential Boston storm, the heavy tires gripping the wet, treacherous asphalt with an aggressive, terrifying precision. I sat completely frozen in the passenger seat, my forensic accountant brain automatically shifting into a clinical, desperate, internal risk assessment. It was a survival mechanism, a habit forged in the fires of my disastrous past with Victor. When the world spiraled out of my control, I found my only solace in data. I analyzed the dangerous trajectory of our speed, the audible click of the centralized locking mechanism sealing me inside, and the terrifyingly rigid, unyielding posture of the man beside me. Dante was a statue carved from pure lethal intent. The blurring streetlights flickered rapidly across his sharp, aristocratic profile, illuminating the muscle feathering wildly along his tight jawline. His large, calloused hands gripped the leather-wrapped steering wheel, with enough sheer force to turn his prominent knuckles bone-white. The massive Alarico signet ring on his finger, a symbol of the empire that had just swallowed me whole, caught the brief, blinding flashes of passing headlights. It was a constant, mocking reminder that I was no longer an employee. I was a captive. "Mr. Alarico," I attempted to say, my voice sounding painfully thin, trembling slightly despite my absolute best efforts to keep it clinically detached. "You need to pull over. This is unnecessary. I have work tomorrow morning." And he did not look at me. His gaze remained locked on the rain-slicked road ahead, tracking the chaotic, swerving traffic with the predatory, unblinking focus of a hawk tracking a mouse in an open field. "Your work is up in the penthouse tier, Clara." His gravelly baritone vibrated through the small, pressurized confines of the cabin, the sound physically scraping against my frayed nerve endings. "And you are currently sitting in my vehicle, having just attempted to leave my building in the passenger seat of another man's car. Do not speak to me about what is necessary." The sheer, territorial possession bleeding through his tone made my lungs constrict painfully. He smelled of crisp winter ozone, starched cotton, and the faint, unmistakable copper of fresh blood, a visceral scent profile that perfectly encapsulated the terrifying dichotomy of my employer. He was an elegant, bespoke-suited dinner companion, tethered to something far more dangerous. I turned my face toward the tinted, bullet-resistant glass, watching the neon signs of the city blur into abstract, watery streaks of light. My purse sat heavy in my lap, acting as a physical anchor to the nightmare waiting inside my phone. Victor. The crushing medical debt. The ticking clock of my mother's fragile life at the clinic. If Dante broke down my carefully constructed walls tonight, if his sudden, violent jealousy pushed him to uncover the financial hemorrhage I had been hiding for 6 months, he would not just settle the medical bills. He would eradicate Victor from the face of the earth, and the price for that amount of blood would be my permanent, inescapable residence in his gilded cage. The drive did not lead back to the familiar glass and steel Alarico high-rise, nor did it lead to any of the standard corporate properties I regularly audited in the heavy syndicate logbook. We crossed the city limits, the dense, suffocating urban sprawl gradually giving way to the sprawling, heavily forested, and deeply isolated outskirts of Massachusetts. The armored SUV turned down a private, unmapped road, the blinding headlights cutting through the violent storm, to reveal towering wrought iron gates. They swung open automatically, sensing our approach, granting us access to the Alarico Syndicate's primary fortress. The private estate was a masterpiece of fortified architecture, a sprawling, imposing stone mansion that looked less like a home, and far more like a high-security sanctuary, designed to withstand a siege. The moment the heavy tires crunched to a halt on the pristine gravel driveway, the massive front doors of the estate opened. Armed guards in tailored dark suits stepped out into the freezing rain with large black umbrellas, moving with a silent, synchronized efficiency that spoke of military training. Dante cut the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. He unbuckled his seatbelt, finally turning his intense, stormy gaze directly toward me. The violent, explosive jealousy that had erupted in the parking garage 20 minutes ago was now banked beneath a thick layer of calculated, icy resolve. "We are going inside," he stated, his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. "And you are going to tell me exactly what has been draining the life out of my best forensic accountant for the past 6 months." He did not wait for my response. He stepped out into the freezing downpour and rounded the hood of the massive vehicle in mere seconds, pulling my door open before the guards could even reach us. The biting cold wind instantly tore into my exposed skin, but before I could flinch away from the elements, his large hand settled firmly on the small of my lower back. The intense heat of his palm, bleeding through my thin blouse, was a branding iron. He guided me up the wet stone steps, his massive, imposing frame shielding to me entirely from the driving rain. The transition from the chaotic, freezing storm outside to the hyper-controlled environment of the estate was incredibly jarring. The massive oak doors sealed shut behind us with a heavy thud, instantly silencing the raging thunder. The air inside smelled deeply of wood smoke, old paper, and rich beeswax polish. It was oppressively warm, the carefully regulated temperature contrasting violently with the damp, bone-deep chill clinging to my ruined clothes. Silas Thorne materialized from a shadowed side corridor, his heavy tactical boots completely silent against the imported, pristine marble floor. The massive driver barely acknowledged me, immediately handing Dante a secure, encrypted satellite phone. "The waterfront discrepancy you isolated, boss," Silas murmured, his dark eyes flicking briefly to my shivering, pathetic form, before returning strictly to his employer. "The target crew is moving. They think the storm is providing cover for their shipment." Dante's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking dangerously. The 3% variance I had meticulously found in the shipping logistics was not just a minor clerical error. It was the definitive trigger for a full-scale syndicate war. He looked down at me, the brutal conflict between his duty as a ruthless underworld boss and his consuming obsession with me warring openly in his harsh expression. "Wait in the library," Dante commanded, his tone dropping a full octave, slipping seamlessly into the undeniable, terrifying cadence of a ruler issuing a decree. "Do not move from that room, Clara. If you attempt to call a cab, I will have Silas shoot the tires out before it reaches the front gate. I need exactly 5 minutes to authorize the strike, and then you and I are going to have a very long, very honest conversation." He turned on his heel, striding swiftly down the long, dimly lit hallway with Silas, the secure phone already pressed tightly to his ear. I was left standing entirely alone in the grand, echoing foyer, completely isolated in the very heart of the underworld. A silent, heavily armed guard stepped forward, gesturing respectfully, but firmly toward a set of heavy mahogany doors to my immediate right. I walked on trembling, unreliable legs, pushing the heavy doors open to enter the library. It was magnificent, a room walled entirely with floor-to-ceiling leather-bound volumes, heavy legal texts, and dense history books. A massive roaring stone fireplace crackled intensely at the far end, casting a warm, flickering golden glow over the intricate woven rugs and deep, dark leather armchairs. But I could not appreciate the breathtaking luxury, or the intoxicating smell of old paper. I was suffocating under the crushing weight of Victor's impending, catastrophic deadline. I collapsed into one of the oversized armchairs, my fingers shaking violently as I pulled my phone from my purse. The cracked screen immediately lit up with another notification. 42 hours left, Clara. I am drafting the proxy paperwork now. Your mother's doctors will be very interested to hear from her legal guardian regarding her extremely expensive care in the ICU. My vision instantly blurred. A dry, painful sob tore from my throat, a pathetic, involuntary sound born of absolute, bone-deep exhaustion. I leaned forward, resting my heavy head in my trembling hands, my brilliant analytical mind frantically trying to calculate a way out of a mathematical impossibility. I was drowning, and the water was rising fast. The heavy mahogany doors of the library swung open with a smooth, completely silent grace. I flinched violently, my somatic hypervigilance spiking to terrifying levels, fully expecting Dante to walk in, and ruthlessly demand my darkest secrets. Instead, Julian Sterling strolled casually into the room. Dante's underboss looked completely unbothered by the fact that he had nearly triggered a brutal homicide in the subterranean parking garage mere 20 minutes ago. His bespoke charcoal suit was perfectly dry, meaning he had likely driven his silver sports car directly into the secure underground tunnel of the estate. He carried a heavy crystal decanter of amber liquid and 2 crystal glasses, his highly charismatic, terrifyingly observant eyes locking onto my hunched, miserable form immediately. "I see you survived the armored transport," Julian greeted, his voice a smooth, warm purr that stood in stark, jarring contrast to Dante's gravelly, demanding barks. He walked over to the small, polished mahogany table beside my chair, setting the glasses down with a quiet clink. I took a shortcut. "Thought you might need a strong drink after experiencing my best Fortet legendary temper firsthand." I quickly wiped my wet eyes, sitting up straight, and desperately forcing my professional, detached mask back into place. "Mr. Sterling, you should not be in here." Mr. Alarico was incredibly clear about his strict boundaries regarding my location. "Dante's boundaries are mostly just suggestions when it comes to me." Julian chuckled darkly, pouring a generous, heavy measure of expensive whiskey into one of the glasses. He picked it up and extended it toward me, the amber liquid catching the firelight. "Drink, Clara. You look like you are about to shatter into 1,000 pieces." He closed the remaining distance between us, his smooth movements lacking the overwhelming, suffocating gravity of Dante, but possessing a distinct, highly predatory grace of their own. He stood entirely too close, his warm, casual familiarity deliberately designed to bypass my defensive shields. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers gently brushing a damp, freezing strand of hair away from my pale cheek. "You are still freezing," he noted softly, his hyper-observant gaze instantly cataloging the violent tremor racking my shoulders. "Step away from her, Julian." The words were not shouted. They were delivered in a terrifyingly quiet, entirely lethal register that instantly dropped the ambient temperature in the grand library below freezing. Like a predator had just revealed itself, and every prey animal in the vicinity suddenly remembered exactly what true fear tasted like. My body reacted before my brain could even process the threat. I shrank back deep into the leather armchair, my fingers white-knuckling the thick armrests, my heart slamming against my ribs in a frantic staccato rhythm. Dante Alarico stood in the doorway. He had shed his expensive suit jacket and tie, the top 3 buttons of his dark dress shirt undone, exposing the raw, violent power of his heavily muscled frame. His unyielding, metallic eyes were locked dead onto the exact space where Julian's fingers still lingered near my face. His expression was a mask of pure, unadulterated homicidal jealousy. Julian did not flinch. He did not step back. He simply offered a slow, deeply knowing smile, calmly withdrawing his hand and turning fully to face his oldest childhood friend. "Relax, Dante. I was merely offering your shivering secretary a glass of 20-year-old scotch to warm her blood. You practically drove her through a monsoon to get here. I do not need your unwanted assistance in caring for what is mine." Dante snarled, crossing the intricate rug in slow, incredibly deliberate strides. The absolute, crushing authority radiating from his massive frame was suffocating. He stopped directly between Julian and my chair, deliberately and physically blocking the underboss's line of sight to me. He used his sheer size as an impenetrable shield of absolute presence. "The waterfront logistics currently require your direct oversight in the war room now." Julian raised his empty hands in a gesture of mock surrender, though his intelligent eyes danced with the profound satisfaction of a man who had successfully proven a very dangerous point. "Of course, boss. Try not to terrify her to death before I get back." Julian offered me a brief, completely cheerful wink before slipping smoothly past Dante's massive bulk and exiting the library, leaving the heavy mahogany doors slightly ajar behind his retreating form. Dante did not turn to face me immediately. He stood entirely rigid, his broad, powerful chest rising and falling heavily, as he actively fought to control the violent, consuming possessiveness that his best friend had deliberately and masterfully stoked. He braced his large hands on the stone mantelpiece above the roaring fire, staring intensely into the crackling flames as if trying to burn away his own rage. "I have 3 final, highly secure calls to make regarding the strike on the waterfront," Dante said, his deep voice heavily strained, tightly coiled with a dangerous, explosive intensity. "I will be in my private study across the hall. When I return to this room, Clara, There will be absolutely no more lies. No more maintaining your desperate professional distance. You will give me the entire truth, or I will forcibly take it from you." He turned and walked out of the library without waiting a single second for my response. The heavy doors clicked firmly shut, sealing me back into my solitary echoing panic. I was trembling uncontrollably now, the adrenaline crash hitting me with devastating force. I reached down with clumsy fingers to retrieve my phone from the floor, where I had dropped it in my initial shock. The screen had cracked slightly upon impact, a jagged, ugly web of broken glass partially obscuring the new text message that had just arrived. It was a photo. A high-resolution picture of the main entrance to the clinic, taken directly from the street level. "I am sitting in the parking lot, Clara." Victor's follow-up text read. "I wonder what the arrogant nursing staff will say when I walk in waving a valid marriage certificate and demand to transfer her care to a much cheaper state-run facility." Tick-tock. Don't test me. A physical, violently intense wave of nausea hit me, making the room spin. The distinct copper of blood heavily coated my tongue as I accidentally bit the soft inside of my cheek in sheer terror. I was out of time. I was entirely out of leverage. The door to the library opened again, very quietly this time. I immediately assumed it was Silas, coming to stand silent guard over Dante's captive. But it was Julian. He had absolutely not gone to the war room. He stepped inside, pushing the door shut. His charismatic, easygoing smile was completely gone, entirely replaced by a sharp, clinical seriousness that made him look just as dangerous as Dante. He moved quickly, crossing the large room with silent grace and kneeling directly beside my chair before I could even register his sudden presence. "He is on the secure satellite phone with the Colombians," Julian murmured, keeping his voice incredibly low, a mere breath in the quiet room. He looked down at the cracked screen of my phone, his hyper-observant eyes instantly absorbing the damning image of the hospital and the violent extortion threat beneath it. I tried to rapidly pull the device away, my defensive, survival instincts flaring hotly, but the underboss gently but firmly caught my freezing wrist. "I run this entire syndicate's intelligence network, Clara," Julian said softly, his sharp, intelligent eyes locking securely onto mine. "You honestly thought I didn't know? About Martha? Regarding the $89,000 in crushing medical debt? Concerning Victor Cross and his pathetic extortion attempts?" I stopped breathing entirely. The impenetrable walls of my carefully constructed, desperately guarded secret were violently collapsing all around me. "If you know, does Mr. Alarico know?" "No," Julian replied instantly, his large thumb lightly, rhythmically brushing the frantic pulse point on my wrist to calm my racing, terrified heart. "Dante only sees you. He is so utterly, completely blinded by his consuming obsession with keeping you close, that he hasn't looked past his own blinding jealousy to see the heavy chains actively dragging you down. But if he sees this text message, if he understands what Victor is doing, he will absolutely kill Victor tonight. And the very moment Dante sheds blood for you, he will claim you forever. You will never, ever be free." A cold, heavy knot formed rapidly in the pit of my stomach. Julian was speaking the absolute terrifying truth. With his free hand, Julian reached smoothly into the inner breast pocket of his bespoke charcoal jacket and pulled out a sleek black checkbook. He clicked a silver pen and quickly, fluidly scribbled a massive sum on the crisp paper, tearing it out with a sharp rip and pressing it firmly into my trembling hand. I looked down at the slip of paper. It was a blank check drawn from a completely clean, entirely untraceable corporate offshore account, signed elegantly by Julian Sterling. "Take the money, Clara," Julian offered, his voice a hushed, incredibly intimate whisper. "Clear the clinic in full. Give Victor his pathetic extortion fee to completely disappear. I can have a private, untraceable jet ready and waiting at Hanscom Airfield by dawn. I can get you and your mother entirely out of Boston, out of the syndicate's bloody reach, and far, far away from Dante's cage." I stared blankly at the slip of paper, the sheer, unimaginable weight of the offer crashing over me like a tidal wave. It was absolutely everything I had spent the last 2 grueling years fighting for. True freedom, absolute safety, the total, immediate liquidation of my crushing financial anxiety. All I had to do was blindly accept his secret charity and run into the night. But even as Julian's fingers lingered near mine, my mind kept drifting to the heavy platinum Alarico signet ring, to the terrifying heat of Dante's palm against my lower back, to the absolute, unshakable certainty that my employer would burn the entire city to ash before letting anyone take me from him. Suddenly, a violent echoing crash, shattered the quiet tension in the library. The sound came from across the hall, the unmistakable, brutal noise of heavy crystal being smashed against mahogany, followed instantly by the dull, terrifying thud of a fist colliding with a solid wall. My heart leaped into my throat. Dante's private study. I looked up at Julian, seeing the sudden, dangerous spark of realization in his intelligent eyes. The library had security cameras. Of course it did. Dante was watching us. He was watching his oldest friend kneel intimately before the woman he considered his absolute property. He was watching Julian gently hold my wrist, speaking in a hushed, secretive tone, and pressing a piece of paper directly into my hand. Though the audio feed was likely muted, the visual narrative was devastatingly, violently clear to a man already pushed completely to the brink of insanity by his own jealousy. Julian was offering me a way out. Julian was actively playing the savior. The silence that followed the crash from across the hall was thick, suffocating, and entirely lethal. I looked deeply at Julian's face, seeing the genuine, underlying concern beneath his highly calculated, charismatic exterior. The offer was a literal lifeline thrown to a drowning, desperate woman. But it was a lifeline tethered to cowardice. I slowly curled my stiff fingers, securely closing my hand. But not around the check. I pushed the slip of paper firmly back against Julian's chest, my spine straightening with absolute resolve as the highly competent forensic accountant, the professional survivor who had clawed her way out of hell, reclaimed total control of my trembling body. No, I whispered fiercely, my voice carrying a newly forged core of absolute, unbreakable steel. I do not trade one mafia boss's cage for the dead of another. I am not running anymore, Julian. I will face him. Before Julian could even begin to argue, before he could attempt to press the money back into my hand, the heavy mahogany doors of the library were violently, explosively kicked open. The heavy wood slammed hard against the stone walls, with the deafening force of a detonation. Dante stood framed in the doorway, absolute murder radiating from his massive frame. Blood, warm and fresh, dripped steadily from his right hand, staining the pristine marble floor beneath his expensive shoes. He didn't even seem to feel the pain. His cold, charcoal eyes bypassed Julian entirely, locking onto me with a possessive, territorial fury that consumed all the oxygen in the room. In my world, Dante snarled, his tone plunging to a lethal, hushed frequency that shook the very foundation of the estate. When I claim something as mine, I protect it absolutely. If we do this, if we become this, you're mine. Fully. He stepped into the library, stalking toward us like a lethal predator that had finally cornered its prey. And I don't share. I don't let go. Julian did not lose his calculated, terrifying composure. He simply stood up from his kneeling position beside my oversized leather armchair, moving with that fluid, predatory grace that defined the syndicate's underboss. He casually adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit, entirely unbothered by the homicidal aura radiating off his oldest friend. There is no need to bleed all over the imported silk rugs, Dante, Julian noted mildly, his hyper-observant gaze flicking briefly to the crimson drops hitting the polished floorboards. I was merely offering our overworked executive secretary a charitable bonus. A preemptive severance package, if you will, to save her from your legendary temper. Get out, Julian. The command was not shouted. It was delivered in a deadly, hushed register that promised immediate, catastrophic violence. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop, thick with the unyielding promise of physical retaliation. Julian offered me a final, knowing look, a glance that acknowledged the absolute chaos he had deliberately unleashed, before slipping past the massive, rigid frame of his boss. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, plunging the grand library into a suffocating, highly pressurized silence. I remained completely frozen in the chair. The crisp paper of Julian's blank check felt incredibly heavy in my hand, a physical manifestation of the criminal underworld dragging me deeper into its currents. My breath came in shallow, ragged bursts that I could not regulate. The physical reality of Dante Alarico in this state was completely overwhelming. He smelled of cold winter rain, expensive Italian leather, and the faint, unmistakable copper of fresh blood. The blood dripped from his split knuckles, a stark, violent contrast to the immaculate, gilded cage of his private library. I forced my trembling fingers to uncurl. I held the check out, my analytical mind screaming at me to re-establish professional boundaries before the possessive fury radiating from him consumed me entirely. Every instinct honed by years of navigating Victor and his cowardly abuse told me to make myself small, to disappear, to apologize. But Dante was not Victor. Dante did not want me small. He wanted me absolute. I will not take it, I stated, my voice shaking violently despite my desperate attempt to sound clinically detached. I refused him the moment he offered it. I am not trading one mafia debt for another. I will not be leveraged by Julian, and I will not take his money to run. He crossed the room in 3 long, deliberate strides. The absolute, crushing authority of his presence pinned me to the leather upholstery. He stopped directly in front of me, his large chest rising and falling heavily beneath his unbuttoned dress shirt. Without a single word, he reached out with his uninjured left hand. The Alarico signet ring caught the firelight as he smoothly plucked Julian's blank check from my outstretched fingers. His skin brushed mine, a searing contrast of intense heat against my cold, trembling hands. Dante barely glanced at the astronomical sum Julian had scribbled there. He turned his broad back to me, walked directly to the roaring stone fireplace, and tossed the slip of paper into the open flames. The fire flared momentarily, the bright orange tongues curling around the edges of the paper, consuming the clean offshore money and turning it into useless gray ash that floated up the chimney. I am not negotiating the terms of my surrender, Mr. Alarico. I pushed forward, forcing myself to stand despite my shaking knees. I needed to be on my feet. I needed to reclaim the clinical, hyper-competent persona that kept me alive. I am clarifying the boundaries of my employment. I am here to untangle your assets and correct your ledgers. I am not your property to be fought over, and I am not a pawn in whatever psychological war Julian is waging against you. Dante turned slowly. The muscle feathering along his tight jawline indicated a man actively fighting a brutal war against his own lethal instincts. He looked down at his right hand, at the split knuckles oozing warm blood, and then he looked directly at me. His gaze was a physical weight, stripping away the professional armor I tried so desperately to hold on to. You are hiding a mountain of debt, Clara Mercer. You are being extorted by a coward who thinks he can use your mother's failing health to drain you dry. And my underboss thought he could wrap you in his emerald velvet coat and hand you a check to test my absolute limits. He took a slow step closer, lowering his voice into a dark, vibrating hum. There are no escape routes left, Clara. Not from him, and absolutely not from me. My heart slammed against my ribs, a somatic spike of pure panic mixed with a terrifying, unbidden rush of relief. The sheer, overwhelming force of his protection was intoxicating. How did you know about the debt? The heavy doors to the library opened again, abruptly interrupting my terror. Silas Thorne stepped into the room, his massive tactical boots completely silent on the marble. The driver did not flinch at the sight of his bleeding boss, or the shattered remnants of the glass across the hall. He held a sleek, silver tablet in his large hands, his expression a mask of grim, unyielding professionalism. Boss, Silas rumbled, his dark eyes fixed entirely on Dante, but his words carried an undercurrent of absolute respect that he rarely extended to outsiders. The harbor targets are moving. They are exploiting the cover of the storm, exactly as we anticipated. Dante's steely gaze snapped away from me, the possessive fury instantly shifting into a cold, calculated operational mode. The transition was terrifyingly seamless, a stark reminder of the empire he controlled. The South Boston shipping lanes? Yes, Silas confirmed, tapping the screen of his tablet, his large fingers swiping past encrypted tactical maps. They are pushing the unsanctioned assets through the precise logistics channels Clara flagged. It matches the encrypted data in the black leather ledger perfectly. They thought the storm would hide the transport, but the 3% discrepancy she located gave us their exact operational window. Your analyst was entirely correct. We have them cornered. A profound, heavy silence filled the library, thick with the gravity of the impending violence. Dante turned his head slowly, looking at me with a terrifyingly proud possessiveness that made the breath catch in my throat. I had not just organized his files. I had not just balanced his corporate accounts. I had handed him the strategic leverage to dismantle a rival operation. My mind, my mathematical precision, was the weapon he was currently wielding to secure his territory. My strategist, Dante murmured, the words vibrating with a dark, clanging resonance that settled deep in my chest. She found the leak they spent 6 months burying. Dispatch the strike team, Silas. Liquidate the harbor assets. Leave no survivors. Already done, Silas replied smoothly, the casual confirmation of multiple assassinations chilling my blood. But there is a secondary issue. We just caught a massive anomaly on the top-tier external servers at the corporate headquarters. An unencrypted message bypassed the standard corporate firewall. It was flagged directly by the security algorithm, because it was addressed to your personal executive inbox and heavily referenced Clara's employee ID. Dante extended his uninjured hand. Silas handed over the device. As Dante read the digital text, the ambient temperature in the grand library seemed to plummet below freezing. The terrifying stillness returned to his massive frame. The exact, predatory silence that always preceded a total dismantling of his enemies. The muscles in his neck corded, and the air grew so thin I had to actively force my lungs to expand. "Read it," Dante commanded softly, turning the screen toward me. I leaned forward to look at the bright display, my knees trembling again. My analytical mind, usually so sharp and impenetrable, stalled completely as I absorbed the catastrophic stupidity of the words on the screen. It was Victor, the toxic, vindictive coward who had spent the last 2 years holding my mother's medical proxy over my head, had bypassed the general corporate switchboard to send an extortion email directly to the head of the Alarico syndicate. He believed Dante was just a wealthy, legitimate businessman running a standard logistics firm. He had absolutely no idea he had just threatened the most ruthless mafia don on the East Coast. To Dante Alarico, the message read, "Your executive secretary, Clara Mercer, is financially compromised and legally unstable. She currently owes me $89. Zero in medical proxy debt related to Martha Mercer's intensive care. If your firm does not settle this balance in full within 24 hours, I will expose her fraudulent guardianship status to the state medical board. I will create a massive PR scandal for your pristine company. I know exactly where her mother is. I know where Clara works. Pay up or watch your corporate reputation burn." A physical, violently intense wave of nausea hit me again. A sour rush of adrenaline flooded my mouth. Attached to the bottom of the email was the exact file that had been haunting my phone for weeks. Victor's blackmail photo. It was a grainy shot of the clinic's entrance, proving he had been physically stalking the premises. He had been standing outside the very doors, where my mother was fighting for her life on a ventilator. The sheer, cowardly vindictiveness of the man was matched only by his breathtaking ignorance. Victor was attempting to blackmail a syndicate kingpin with a threat of bad public relations. It was like threatening a hurricane with a lawsuit. "He is a fool," I whispered, my brain automatically calculating the devastating fallout. I could already see the trajectory of Victor's imminent destruction. "Mr. Alarico, please. Victor Cross is a pathetic gambler. He does not understand who he is speaking to. I can handle this. If he attempts to contact the clinic administration, I have drafted legal injunctions. Do not insult my intelligence by suggesting you pay this parasite a single dime," Dante interrupted, his pitch lowering to a dangerous, guttural vibration that vibrated against my sternum. He tossed the silver tablet onto the polished mahogany table with a sharp clack. He threatened my operation. He threatened Martha Mercer. But most importantly, Clara, he threatened you. Dante stepped completely into my personal space, forcing me to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. His height was overwhelming, his shadow swallowing me entirely. His large, uninjured hand came up to cup my jaw. The touch was firm, absolutely unyielding, and terrifyingly warm against my freezing skin. His thumb brushed over my cheekbone, the rough callus a stark reminder of the extreme violence he was capable of unleashing. The scent of cedar and leather enveloped me, offering a terrifying sanctuary. "You are no longer an employee clocking out at 5, Dante declared, his iron-gray irises locking onto mine with an intensity that burned away all my remaining oxygen. "I am placing you under an absolute, immediate curfew. You do not leave this estate. You do not return to your apartment. You do not go anywhere near the medical center. You are confined to these walls until I personally dismantle Victor Cross and erase his existence from your life." "You cannot lock me up," I protested, my somatic hypervigilance flaring wildly against the concept of a gilded cage. My pulse hammered violently against his thumb. "My mother is critically ill. If I don't show up to verify her experimental drug dosages, the nursing staff might make an error. If Victor goes to the medical board, they could freeze her insurance. I have to be there." "He will not take another breath near that building," Dante promised, his tone vibrating with a dark, absolute certainty. "It wasn't a threat. It was an execution order, and you will remain exactly where I can see you. Silas has already deployed a tactical security detail to the ICU. The corridor outside Martha Mercer's room is currently holding 6 armed men. But you, Clara, stay here. That is not a negotiation. It is a mandate." He dropped his hand from my face, the sudden loss of his intense heat, leaving me shivering violently in the heavy air of the library. Dante turned to Silas, his operational mask fully secured. Lock down the perimeter. No one enters or leaves the estate without my direct authorization. Have the medical team come to the library to stitch my hand. Then pull every piece of surveillance data on Victor Cross. I want his daily routine, his gambling debts, and his exact GPS coordinates. Understood, boss. Silas nodded, turning swiftly to execute the orders without a single question, disappearing into the dark corridor like a phantom. Dante looked back at me one last time, his gaze heavy with the unspoken weight of his absolute possession. He didn't need to say the words again. The gilded cage had officially snapped shut around me. The transition from the library to the guest suite was a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. 2 of Dante's silent, heavily armed guards had escorted me through the labyrinthine corridors of the estate, leaving me in a room that was larger than my entire apartment. The door clicked shut behind me, the heavy locking mechanism engaging with a finality that echoed in my chest. I spent the remainder of the night pacing the length of the massive, silk-draped bed, my nervous system too wired for sleep. The contrast was agonizing. I was surrounded by millions of dollars of imported marble and antique furnishings, yet I felt entirely reduced to a hostage, a highly protected, deeply valued hostage, but a hostage nonetheless. The next morning arrived without the chaotic, driving violence of the storm, leaving behind a cold, damp chill that hung heavy over the sprawling Massachusetts estate. The sky was a pale, slate gray, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured grounds. My mind was trapped in a relentless, exhausting loop of calculations, variables, and terrifying outcomes. The plush bedding had offered no comfort. Dante's curfew was absolute. The massive wrought iron gates were sealed shut, and the perimeter was actively patrolled. I was trapped in the lap of dark luxury, wearing an oversized cashmere sweater provided by the estate staff that swallowed my frame in soft, agonizingly expensive warmth. I was pacing the intricate stone pathways of the walled Alarico garden, my boots crunching rhythmically against the frost-covered gravel. The garden was a masterpiece of controlled nature. Sharp, geometric hedges, dormant winter rose bushes stripped of their color, and a towering, ornate stone fountain that trickled quietly in the center. It was a pristine display of immense wealth, but to my hyper-vigilant brain, it was merely an exceptionally decorated prison yard. Every camera lens mounted on the stone walls tracked my movements. I wrapped ancient arms tightly around my waist, the biting winter air did a little to numb the crushing anxiety in my chest. Dante was currently locked in his secure war room on the opposite side of the mansion, orchestrating the systematic destruction of the man who had tormented me for years. He was wielding his vast syndicate resources to crush a pathetic street gambler. But my primary concern was not my abusive ex-partner's fate. It was Martha. When Victor realized his extortion attempt had failed, when he sensed even a fraction of the syndicate's retaliation closing in on him, his cowardly instinct would be to strike at my weakest point. He still held the lingering legal loopholes of my mother's proxy paperwork. He could physically walk into the hospital administration office, demand to transfer her care, and completely disrupt her fragile immunosuppressant infusion protocol. Dante's guards could stop a bullet. They were trained to neutralize physical threats. But they could not stop a legally recognized proxy from discharging a patient without causing a massive, highly publicized scene that would draw the FBI's attention straight to the Alarico syndicate. "You are doing that thing again." A smooth, charismatic voice broke through the quiet trickle of the fountain. I flinched slightly, my breath catching in my throat as I spun around to see Julian Sterling, strolling casually down the pristine gravel path. The underboss looked entirely refreshed, dressed in a thick, tailored wool peacoat over a dark turtleneck that emphasized his lean, athletic build. He carried 2 steaming paper cups of artisan espresso, the rich, dark scent cutting sharply through the cold morning air and wrapping around me like a familiar lifeline. "Doing what?" I asked defensively, stepping away from the icy edge of the fountain. I accepted the warm cup he offered. The heat immediately soaked into my freezing, trembling fingers, providing a small, much-needed anchor of somatic comfort. "Calculating the exact mathematical probability of a disaster," Julian replied, taking a slow sip from his own cup. He stepped up to the edge of the stone fountain, observing me with those highly intelligent, perceptive eyes that never missed a single detail. "Your mind is running at maximum capacity." I can practically hear the gears grinding from across the courtyard. Dante ordered a lockdown, and you're trying to figure out how to break it. I am not trying to break it, I corrected quietly, looking down at the dark, rich liquid in my cup. I am trying to survive it. Dante thinks he can solve everything with intimidation and violence. He thinks deploying a tactical team to a hospital corridor fixes the root vulnerability. But Victor is a parasite who uses the legal system. If he walks into that ICU waving a marriage certificate and demands my mother be discharged, Dante's men cannot legally shoot him in the middle of a crowded lobby without causing a massive federal incident. Julian smiled, a slow, deeply appreciative expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. This is exactly why I tried to give you my blank check last night, Clara. You are the only person in this entire syndicate who looks past the guns and sees the actual logistical vulnerabilities. You don't just react, you anticipate the structural failure. I cannot leave my mother exposed to his legal leverage, I stated, my voice hardening with absolute unyielding resolve. The freezing air stung my cheeks, but I ignored the discomfort. If Dante will not let me leave this estate to protect her, then I have to move her myself. I need to transfer her out of Victor's legal reach before he realizes what is happening and triggers a catastrophic confrontation. Julian leaned against the cold stone of the fountain, his expression shifting from mild amusement into a mask of clinical seriousness. Transferring a critically ill patient who requires a continuous 50 milligram synthetic opiate drip and specialized respiratory telemetry is not like moving a piece of furniture. It requires a highly coordinated medical extraction, and if you do it without Dante's explicit permission, he will consider it a massive breach of his authority. He will tear this city apart. I save my mother for a living, Julian, I said, adapting the bitter truth of my existence to match the cold reality of the garden, which pays enough to survive but never enough to quiet the worry. I cannot rely on a mafia-don't explosive jealousy to navigate complex medical logistics. I have to protect her the only way I know how, by controlling the variables. Julian watched me for a long, silent moment, the steam from his espresso curling into the freezing air between us. He was a man who orchestrated complex psychological games for a living, and I knew he was actively calculating the immense risk of defying his terrifyingly possessive boss. He was weighing my sheer competence against Dante's wrath. The syndicate owns a private, highly secure medical transport division, Julian finally murmured, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that barely carried over the trickling water. We use it to quietly move wounded capos without triggering police reports. It is equipped with state-of-the-art ICU telemetry and staffed by discreet, board-certified trauma surgeons. My heart kicked up a frantic notch, a sudden surge of adrenaline masking my physical exhaustion. The fog of panic began to clear, replaced by the sharp, crystalline clarity of execution. Can we requisition it? I can, Julian confirmed, his eyes narrowing slightly in thought. But we need a destination. We cannot just drive her around the city in an armored ambulance. We need a facility that operates in the shadows. There is a specialized private care facility in the Berkshires, I replied instantly, my analytical mind snapping into high gear, retrieving the precise data I had researched months ago, when I was desperately searching for alternatives to Victor's control. It operates entirely outside the standard state registry. They require a massive upfront deposit, but they do not report patient locations to general medical databases. Once we move her there, Victor's proxy paperwork becomes entirely useless. He will not be able to find her. The legal threat will be neutralized. Julian nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the sheer calculated precision of my plan. It will take until tonight to prep the transport team and forge the discharge paperwork to bypass the hospital administration. We can use the Foundation's charity gala this evening as a smokescreen to get you out. I will handle the financial deposit from my clean offshore accounts. Consider it a loan, Clara, if your pride absolutely demands it. No, I said instantly, the word cutting through the cold air with absolute finality. I stepped back, clutching my warm espresso cup, my spine straightening with fierce independence. I will not repeat the mistakes of my past. I will not take your money, Julian. I told you in the library, and I am telling you now. I am not trading Victor's extortion for a financial debt to a syndicate underboss. Julian raised a dark eyebrow, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his aristocratic features. Clara, this is not the time for stubbornness. The deposit is exorbitant. How do you intend to secure the facility? I will force Dante to cover it as fair compensation for the forensic work I'd just provided. I countered, my voice steady, completely devoid of hesitation. I felt the familiar, empowering rush of professional competence. I handed him the logistical key to dismantling his harbor rivals. My analysis of the black leather ledger was flawless. I located the exact operational window they were exploiting. He owes me standard consulting rates for syndicate-level auditing, and I will leverage that exact discrepancy to fund her transfer, or I will drain my own retirement accounts. But I will not owe you. I am an asset, Julian, not a charity case. Julian stared at me, the surprise shifting into a look of profound, undeniable respect. He slowly lowered his espresso cup, the aristocratic mask slipping to reveal the ruthless strategist underneath. You really are something else, Clara Mercer. Dante has absolutely no idea how to handle a woman who refuses to be bought. I am not negotiating my independence, I replied firmly, staring him down. Will you coordinate the transport? I will have the extraction team ready to move under the cover of tonight's charity gala. Julian conceded, a dark smirk playing at the edge of his mouth. He seemed thoroughly entertained by the prospect of the impending collision. But I highly suggest you prepare your forensic invoice. When Dante finds out you are moving her without his permission, his reaction will make last night's display look like a polite disagreement. I looked up at the towering, fortified walls of the Alarico mansion. Some stories didn't have neat endings. Some involved living daily in spaces between right and wrong, justice and compromise, love and complications. I was standing in the very heart of the criminal underworld, actively conspiring with a mafia underboss to outmaneuver the deadliest kingpin in Boston, all to save the only family I had left. I will handle Mr. Alarico, I said, my voice completely steady despite the absolute terror coiled tightly in my stomach. I took another sip of the scalding espresso, letting the burn ground me in the present moment. Just get the transport ready. He turned and walked back toward the mansion, his bespoke coat sweeping behind him, leaving me alone in the cold, silent garden. I took a deep breath of the freezing air, bracing my spine against the crushing weight of the empire I was about to deliberately defy. I was no longer just surviving, I was operating. The Alarico estate was not merely a heavily fortified syndicate sanctuary. By late that evening, the sprawling property had miraculously transformed into the glittering epicenter of Boston's high society. The annual Alarico Foundation Charity Gala was a breathtaking masterclass in criminal misdirection and corporate theater. Hundreds of the city's wealthiest elites, ambitious politicians, and ruthless corporate titans flooded the grand ballroom, entirely oblivious to the fact that their generous philanthropic donations were actively laundering the very blood money Dante's men had secured during the violent harbor strike us the night before. I was supposed to be locked securely inside my opulent guest suite. I was supposed to be guarded by the terrifying mandate Dante had issued in the library after he smashed his own study to pieces. But Julian Sterling did not rise to the rank of underboss by blindly following the rules of a jealous king. He was a master tactician who saw the chaos of 300 arriving VIP guests not as a security risk, but as the perfect smokescreen. He had orchestrated my extraction from the guest wing with terrifying precision. A midnight blue silk gown had been delivered to my room through a compromised maid, complete with a forged catering credential that allowed me to bypass the internal security checkpoints. The dress was a calculated necessity, a sleek, minimalist armor that allowed me to vanish seamlessly into the sea of high-net-worth guests and flowing champagne. The silk clung to my skin like ice, a stark, physical reminder that I was actively trespassing in a world that could swallow me whole. Silas Thorne and the primary tactical guards were entirely occupied with perimeter defense. Their attention was pulled aggressively outward, toward the chaotic storm of incoming limousines, and the heavy security protocols required for the cartel representatives attending the summit upstairs in the executive war room. I stood perfectly still in a shadowed alcove near the grand marble staircase, nursing a flute of untouched sparkling water. My analytical mind was running at absolute maximum capacity, ignoring the hauntingly beautiful string quartet playing in the center of the room. I was tracking the encrypted GPS coordinates on a modified tracking device Julian had slipped into my hand. The Syndicate Private Medical Transport Division was exactly 12 minutes away from the private clinic where my mother lay trapped. I had perfectly calculated the administration timeline of my mother's 50 milligram synthetic opiate drip. The moment the specialized extraction team breached her room, Her respiratory telemetry would be stable enough to survive the physical transfer to the private care facility in the Berkshires. Every single variable had been meticulously audited, cross-referenced, and secured, but in a world governed by violence, desperation, and greed, variables were notoriously unstable. The ambient, luxurious scent of expensive Tom Ford cologne, imported orchids, and roasted winter chestnuts drifting from the ballroom was suddenly pierced by an alien odor. The sharp, acrid smell of cheap, stale tobacco and nervous sweat invaded the alcove. The physical alarm in my nervous system flared violently. My pulse spiked into a frantic, uneven rhythm before my eyes even fully registered the impending threat. Two men stepped abruptly into the secluded space, effectively cutting off my exit to the main floor. They did not belong here. They wore ill-fitting, rented tuxedos that bunched awkwardly at the shoulders, the synthetic fabric catching the low light in all the wrong ways. Their posture was hunched and jittery, nervous scavengers compared to the predatory, elegant grace of the syndicate capos roaming the estate. They were Victor Cross's associates. "Victor said you were a tough one to track down, Clara." The taller one sneered, his voice a low, grating whisper that made my stomach aggressively turn with nausea. He stepped closer, invading my personal space with a profound lack of boundaries that sent a freezing chill straight down my spine. He had to pay a catering manager $2,000 just to get us inside this snob fest. You think hiding out at your boss's fancy party is going to magically erase $89,000? My breath caught sharply in my throat, a dry, painful constriction that threatened to shatter my composure. My mind raced through the terrifying legal implications. Victor had actually done it. His cowardly desperation had pushed him to bypass the standard corporate warnings and physically infiltrate the Sticket's private sanctuary. He still held the lingering loopholes of my mother's proxy paperwork, and he was actively using these street-level thugs to execute his leverage while Dante was distracted with the cartel summit. "You are trespassing on heavily monitored private property," I stated. I forced my voice to remain clinically detached, projecting the icy authority of a forensic auditor stripping down a fraudulent ledger. Though my hands were shaking so violently, I had to set my crystal flute down on a nearby marble pedestal to keep the glass from rattling against my rings. Victor's threats are entirely meaningless. I am in the process of auditing the medical proxy laws. He has no legal standing to move her. He has enough standing to fax the discharge orders to the clinic at midnight, the second man countered. His eyes dropped disrespectfully to the plunging neckline of the luxurious midnight blue silk, his breath carrying the foul, nauseating stench of stale peppermint and cheap liquor. "Unless you walk out those service doors with us right now and figure out a payment plan. Victor is losing his patience. The bookies are breathing down his neck, and your mother's ventilator is running on borrowed time." I took a slow, defensive step backward. My heel caught slightly on the thick embroidered edge of the Persian rug. The trap was perfectly laid. If I screamed, Silas's heavily armed guards would swarm the alcove in seconds. They would neutralize the threat with extreme prejudice, leaving these two men bleeding out on the marble. But the resulting chaos meant Dante would instantly be alerted to my unauthorized presence on the floor. My deliberate escape from the guest suite would be exposed, the medical transport would be aggressively aborted, and my mother would remain entirely trapped under Victor's vindictive legal control. I had to endure this. I had to outmaneuver them quietly without triggering the apex predator directly above us. "I am not going anywhere with you," I said, my chin lifting in a show of pure, stubborn defiance. "And if you think Victor is going to see a single dime of my money, you are vastly underestimating my capacity to ruin him financially." The taller thug critically misread my calculated silence for submission and my defiance for a bluff. He reached out with startling, aggressive speed. His rough, unwashed fingers clamped down hard around my bare wrist. The grip was brutal, the force instantly bruising the fragile skin over my pulse point. The sudden, violent invasion of my bodily autonomy sent a blinding flash of white-hot panic straight through my skull, triggering every physical memory of the abuse I had survived. Before I could even attempt to pull away, the heavy, suffocating tension in the alcove was shattered. It was shattered by a presence far more dangerous than anything Victor Cross could ever dream of summoning. "You are standing on Alarico marble." The voice was a smooth, charismatic purr, but it carried the lethal, devastating velocity of a sniper's bullet cutting through the cold air. Julian Sterling stepped out from behind the heavy velvet drapes of the adjacent corridor. His bespoke charcoal suit was impeccably tailored, his posture relaxed and casual, with one hand resting lightly in his trouser pocket. But his highly observant eyes were completely dead, hollow, predatory. He did not raise his voice. He did not brandish a concealed weapon. He simply radiated the unyielding, crushing authority of a man who orchestrated mass violence and buried bodies for a living. The thug gripping my wrist froze entirely. His eyes widened in sudden, primal terror as he instantly recognized the syndicate's notorious underboss. "Let go of her," Julian suggested mildly. It was the furthest thing from a request. It was a countdown to an execution. The man instantly released me, stumbling backward as if he had been physically burned by the contact. I cradled my aching wrist against my chest, my breathing ragged and shallow as I fought to keep my defensive shields intact. Julian closed the remaining distance with terrifying, fluid grace. He did not throw a wild punch. He did not lose his temper. He reached out, his elegant fingers wrapping firmly around the lapel of the taller man's rented tuxedo. With a sharp, surgically precise twist, Julian drove his hardened knuckles as directly into the vulnerable nerve cluster at the base of the man's throat. The thug dropped heavily to his knees on the marble floor. He gasped soundlessly for air, his hands flying to his neck as his face rapidly turned a dark, mottled purple as his airway spasmed. The second associate backed away in sheer horror, his hands raised in frantic, pathetic surrender, his bravado evaporating in the face of true, institutionalized violence. "Victor Cross is a dead man walking," Julian whispered. He leaned down, so only the two suffocating intruders could hear the chilling promise of their impending demise over the distant sound of the string quartet. "And if either of you ever breathe the same air as this woman again, I will personally ensure your bodies are never recovered from the harbor. Walk out the service exit now." They scrambled wildly to their feet. They fled, practically tripping over each other in their desperate haste to escape the alcove and the quiet wrath of the underboss. Julian slowly straightened his tailored cuffs, the lethal predator vanishing instantly behind his charming, aristocratic mask, as if the violence had never occurred. He turned to me, his sharp gaze dropping immediately to the red, angry marks already blooming furiously on my pale skin. "Are you functional?" he asked quietly. The genuine concern cut through the heavy subtext of our conspiracy, a reminder of the strange, dangerous alliance we had forged in the garden. "Yes," I lied. My voice trembled as I actively forced my analytical mind to suppress the overwhelming somatic shock. I could not afford to break down in the shadows. Not tonight. The transport is exactly 3 miles from the clinic. We have to leave the estate before Victor actually realizes his men failed and sends that fax. Julian offered his arm, a perfectly gentlemanly gesture that completely belied the criminal extraction we were about to perform. "Then let us go steal a patient." We moved swiftly and silently through the opulent corridors, bypassing the crowded grand foyer by utilizing the discreet staff exits Julian knew intimately. The deafening thrum of the gala's orchestra and the clinking of expensive crystal faded into a low, muffled bass line as we pushed through the heavy service doors and stepped out into the freezing night air. The sudden drop in temperature was agonizing. The biting winter wind instantly tore through the thin silk of my midnight blue gown, raising sharp goosebumps along my bare arms. I shivered violently, crossing my arms tightly over my chest, but the intense physical discomfort was eclipsed by the surging, chaotic adrenaline of our rebellion. The private valet area was a chaotic swirl of arriving limousines and heavily armored sedans. Exhaust plumes rose like thick white smoke into the dark, starless sky. Julian did not wait for the overwhelmed attendants. His sleek, silver sports car was already idling near the far edge of the circular driveway, strategically positioned directly outside the primary camera angles. Silas had established for the perimeter defense grid. "Get in quickly," Julian instructed, placing a firm, guiding hand on the small of my back. The touch was entirely platonic, a mere logistical push to shield my shivering frame from the biting wind. But to the outside world, to anyone watching from the heights of the estate, it painted a devastating picture of deep, protective intimacy. I hurried toward the passenger side. Julian opened the low door for me, and the vehicle's dry, conditioned heat washed over my chilled skin. I slid into the low bucket seat, my hands immediately pulling up the encrypted tracking data on my device to monitor the ambulance's critical progress through the Boston traffic. The Berkshire's facility has confirmed the offshore deposit. Julian leaned down, resting his forearm casually on the roof of the car as he spoke quietly through the open doorway. I looked up at him, my grip tightening on the edge of the leather seat. The money. It was the crucial anchor of my independence. My money, Julian. You used the forensic invoice fee I extracted from Dante for finding the 3% discrepancy in his ledgers, correct? Not your personal funds. Julian offered a rare, completely genuine smile, acknowledging my fierce, uncompromising pride. Exactly as you demanded, Clara. I merely utilized my clean offshore routing channels to bypass Victor's surveillance. Every single cent of the deposit was funded by the forensic consulting fee you rightfully earned from the syndicate. The moment we get Martha secured in the transport, she vanishes completely from the state registry. You bought her freedom yourself. A profound, staggering wave of emotional relief threatened to break my ironclad composure. I had spent my entire tenure at the Alarico high-rise being entirely invisible, carrying a crushing mountain of medical debt and the suffocating weight of Victor's abuse completely alone. Tonight, using my sheer intellect, my professional leverage, and Julian's logistical routing, I was actively liquidating that burden. I nodded, offering a small, exhausted smile of profound gratitude. But as I tilted my head to look at the underboss, my hyper-vigilant gaze involuntarily drifted upward. I was drawn by the same terrifying instinct that prey animals feel when the massive shadow of an apex predator crosses the open grass. My heart executed a violent, painful stutter against my ribs. My breath stalled completely in my lungs. The oxygen froze in my throat. High above the bustling circular driveway jutting out from the massive, imposing stone architecture of the estate was a private, wraparound balcony. It was the exclusive outdoor terrace attached directly to the executive war room. The exact location where Dante was supposed to be deeply entrenched in a high-stakes summit with the Colombian cartel representatives, utilizing my discrepancy analysis to negotiate territorial borders. He was standing there. The ambient golden light, spilling from the open French doors behind him, illuminated his massive, rigid silhouette against the dark, violent winter sky. Dante was dressed in stark black, stripped of his bespoke suit jacket. His broad shoulders were pulled back with an agonizing, unnatural tension that looked ready to snap bone. He was not looking at the cartel bosses inside. He was not analyzing the perimeter defense or watching the arriving VIPs. His piercing gaze was locked exclusively on the silver sports car. He saw me. He saw the woman he had explicitly ordered, confined to the impenetrable safety of his guest wing, dressed in a breathtaking silk gown, sitting willingly in the passenger seat of another man's vehicle. He saw Julian, his trusted underboss, his oldest childhood friend, leaning intimately into my space, his hand having just left the bare skin of my lower back. The visual was devastatingly, catastrophically damning. I could not hear his voice over the low rumble of the idling engines. I could not see the minute micro-expressions on his harsh face from this extreme distance. But I did not need to. The sheer explosive velocity of his jealousy radiated from the high balcony like a physical, suffocating shockwave. It felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked from the courtyard. Dante was holding a heavy crystal tumbler of whiskey in his right hand. As Julian closed my car door and rounded the hood to the driver's side, I watched in absolute paralyzed horror as Dante's legendary, calculated restraint shattered completely into a million jagged pieces. His massive fist clenched. The thick crystal simply exploded under the immense, uncontrollable pressure. The glass shattered, raining sharp, glittering shards down onto the stone balustrade. The dark amber liquid mixed instantly with the fresh, bright copper of his own blood, dripping steadily over the edge of the stone to fall toward the earth below. He didn't even flinch at the pain. He didn't look down at his ruined, bleeding hand. His eyes remained locked on my face through the windshield, burning with a territorial fury so sovereign it made my blood run cold. If our story started with blood and thunder and a woman stupid enough to open her door to danger, tonight was the night I actively invited the storm inside. By attempting to escape his gilded cage, by relying on his best friend to route the funds, to save my mother's life, I had publicly and violently exposed the true depth of his obsession. The powerful cartel capos standing in the war room behind him had undoubtedly witnessed the untouchable, ruthless king of the Boston underworld unravel over the sight of a secretary getting into a car. His jealousy had just exposed his greatest vulnerability to the region's most feared crime bosses. Julian slid into the driver's seat, completely oblivious to the homicidal explosion occurring 50 feet above us. He shifted the sports car into gear, the engine revving with aggressive power. "To the hospital," Julian said smoothly, entirely focused on the extraction logistics. I could not tear my eyes away from the balcony, as the car accelerated sharply down the pristine gravel driveway, the G-force pressing me back into the heated leather. Dante turned slowly away from the stone railing. His broad, blood-soaked back disappeared into the dark shadows of the war room. He was not going back to his meeting to negotiate. He was sensing. The formidable, untouchable power that I had relied on to protect me from the world was now actively, furiously hunting me. The terrifying reality settled heavily into my freezing bones as we sped toward the city limits. My mother was finally going to be safe from Victor Cross, but I had just triggered a catastrophic war of possession that would inevitably burn the rest of my life to the ground. The interior of Julian's silver sports car was a masterpiece of aerodynamic engineering and bespoke luxury. But as we tore through the dark, rain-slicked streets of Boston, it felt exactly like a pressurized cabin moments before a catastrophic decompression. The powerful engine roared, a mechanical growl that vibrated straight through the floorboards and up into my very core. I sat rigidly in the low bucket seat, my hands trembling violently in my lap, my eyes fixed blindly on the blurred city lights flashing past the tinted windshield. I could not stop seeing it. I could not erase the devastating, haunting image of Dante Alarico standing on that high stone balcony, his massive frame silhouetted against the golden light of the war room. I had felt it, the sheer, explosive velocity of his jealousy, from 50 feet below in the freezing air. The way his massive fist had clenched, the heavy crystal tumbler shattering under the immense, uncontrollable pressure of his rage, the dark blood dripping over the stone balustrade, and smearing the syndicate's crest resting heavily on his knuckle, that symbolized his total, undeniable authority. He had not looked like a composed, calculating syndicate kingpin negotiating a multi-million-dollar logistics contract. He looked lethal, a silent promise of ruin, a man who was ready to burn the entire world to the ground. "You need to breathe, Clara," Julian murmured, his smooth, charismatic voice slicing cleanly through the thick, suffocating silence of the cabin. His large hands rested casually on the leather-wrapped steering wheel, guiding the vehicle through the treacherous, rain-slicked traffic with a fluid precision that completely belied the extreme speed we were traveling. He reached toward the center console, his long, elegant fingers flipping a series of silver toggle switches on the dashboard. A moment later, the high-end audio system of the car crackled to life, filling the confined cabin with the encrypted radio frequency of the Alarico Estate's internal security grid. I patched to Silas's primary tactical feed before we left the valet, Julian explained calmly, keeping his intelligent eyes locked on the road ahead. "We need to know exactly when he abandons his post. We need to know the blast radius of his reaction." The static hissed, followed immediately by the chaotic, overlapping shouts of the perimeter guards. The charity gala was still raging on the ground floor, but beneath the delicate notes of the string quartet playing in the background of the transmission, there was a sudden, violent disruption. "Boss," Silas's voice crackled through the speakers, a low, steady rumble of clinical professionalism that sounded unusually strained. The negotiation summit. He was cut off by a deafening, visceral crash that made me flinch violently in my seat. The heavy thud of a massive body hitting a stone architectural support echoed sharply over the open mic, followed by the distant terrified screams of high society socialites scattering in sudden panic. "Where is she?" The guttural, vibrating hum of Dante's voice bled through the speakers. It was distorted by the radio frequency, but it contained a lethal, catastrophic promise of violence that paralyzed the air in my lungs. "Where did he take her, Silas?" I squeezed my eyes shut, my nails digging agonizingly into my palms. The untouchable king of the Boston underworld was publicly unraveling. He was breaking his own impenetrable composure in front of hundreds of VIP guests and international capos. "Clara is secured in the guest wing," Silas replied over the comms, maintaining his flat, operational tone despite what sounded like a desperate physical struggle against his boss. "I placed 2 men at her door. The perimeter is fully locked down. No one has breached the interior. She is not in the guest wing," Dante breathed. Even through the digital distortion, the overwhelming, crushing gravity of his presence was suffocating. I could almost smell the familiar scent of winter cedar and the sharp copper of his blood radiating through the speakers. I just watched my underboss drive her off my property in his silver sports car. While you were staring at the front gates, Julian walked directly into my house, dressed my secretary in midnight blue silk, and took her. There was a tense, agonizing second of static before a frantic voice crackled through the secondary channel. Guest wing detail report. The suite is empty, Silas. The locks weren't forced. She's gone. He used the blind spot near the service exit. Silas stated immediately, pivoting back into crisis management mode, the sound of his heavy tactical boots shifting echoing over the mic. Julian knows the camera sweeps. He positioned his vehicle exactly where the perimeter sensors overlap. It was a calculated departure. I do not care about the methodology, Dante commanded, his cadence shifting to a deadly, quiet frequency that made the ambient temperature in the sports car feel as though it had plummeted below zero. Track the vehicle. Pull every single GPS transponder in the city. Access the traffic grid. I want his exact coordinates right now. Dante, Silas interjected, stepping forward. The extreme gravity of the situation echoed in the rare use of his employer's first name. The international associates are sitting in the war room. If you abandon a high-stakes territorial summit to chase a subordinate over a woman, you expose a massive, critical vulnerability. They will see it as weakness. They will see her as your leverage. Women like her are targets, liabilities. Anyone in my position knows better than to give the world that kind of leverage. You are handing them the knife to cut your throat. A sickening silence stretched over the radio frequency. I held my breath, the reality of Silas's words striking me like a physical blow. I was a liability. I was a forensic accountant drowning in medical debt, dragging the brutal syndicate dynamics into my own desperate attempts to survive my ex-boyfriend's extortion. Let them see it. Dante whispered fiercely over the mic, the possessive, homicidal fury completely overriding his corporate logic. His jealousy had exposed everything. Let the cartel, let Victor Cross. Let the entire goddamn city see exactly what happens when someone touches what is mine. I will tear Boston apart, brick by brick. I will incinerate the shipping lanes. I will drown this entire syndicate in blood before I let Julian drive away with her. Get the armored SUV, Silas. Now. Julian reached out and sharply snapped the radio feed off. The sudden, profound silence in the cabin was almost more terrifying than the violent threats. I dragged in a sharp, ragged breath, the cold air burning the back of my dry throat. The clinging formal wear offered absolutely no protection against the visceral panic rippling through my central nervous system. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, my bruised wrist throbbing a dull, persistent ache where Victor's thug had grabbed me earlier at the gala. He saw us, Julian, I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly small, stripped entirely of the clinical, professional detachment I usually wielded like a shield. You heard him. He is not going to just let this go. We didn't just sneak out of a party. We publicly humiliated the head of the Alarico syndicate in front of his international associates. He is going to declare war. I am fully aware of the political implications of my actions. The underboss replied, his tone remaining incredibly mild, though a dark, deeply intelligent intensity burned in his observant eyes. He navigated a sharp turn, the tires gripping the wet asphalt perfectly. Dante has likely abandoned the summit, alienated 3 major capos, and ordered Silas to track my transponder. His jealousy has completely overridden his tactical programming. Then why did you do it? I demanded, turning in the bucket seat to face him. The sheer, terrifying reality of our situation was crashing down on me in heavy, suffocating waves. Why orchestrate this massive evacuation? You could have just let me use Julian's blank check before Dante burned it in the library. You didn't have to physically drive me. You didn't have to deliberately stand in that alcove and let him see you touching me. You provoked him on purpose. Julian Sterling did not answer immediately. He kept his eyes locked on the dark road, the streetlights illuminating the sharp, aristocratic lines of his profile. He was Dante's oldest childhood friend, the trusted second-in-command who managed the intelligence network of a violent empire. He did not make impulsive decisions. Every single move he made was a calculated push on a chessboard only he could see. He was terrifyingly brilliant. A year of my life, a year of believing someone loved me, had been incinerated in front of 200 witnesses, I continued, my voice gaining a desperate, frantic edge, my fingers gripping the luxurious leather of the door handle. That was what Victor Cross did to me. He broke my reality slowly, using the legal system to bleed me dry. Just 48 hours ago, Victor's blackmail photo of the hospital entrance arrived on my phone. proving he could reach my mother if I didn't pay his $10,000 extortion demand. But Dante doesn't work slowly. He is an avalanche. If his jealousy exposed everything tonight, he is going to destroy the clinic, Victor, and anyone who tries to stop him from dragging me back to his gilded cage. He will not destroy the clinic, Julian finally said, his resonance settling into a dark, vibrating hum. He reached over, his long fingers adjusting the climate control, to flood the passenger side with intense, desperately needed heat. The warm air rushed over my shivering skin, a stark contrast to the freezing terror in my chest. Because by the time the armored SUV reaches the hospital, Martha Mercer will already be gone. She will be safely secured in the Syndicate Private Medical Transport Division, vanishing into the private care facility in the Berkshires. But he will find us, I insisted, my analytical mind instantly calculating the surveillance capabilities of the primary enforcer. Silas will track this car. I disabled the primary GPS transponder before we left the valet. The driver stated calmly, shifting gears as we sped onto the final stretch of the highway leading to the medical district. And I routed our encrypted signal to bounce off 3 dummy towers in South Boston. It will buy us approximately 20 minutes of total invisibility. More than enough time to execute the logistics transfer and get you out of his shadow. I stared at him, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. The underboss of the syndicate was actively committing high treason against his king, utilizing his vast intelligence network to shield a forensic accountant from the boss's consuming obsession. You are risking your own life, I realized quietly, the profound gravity of his actions settling heavily over me. Dante doesn't tolerate betrayal. You are his best friend. Why are you burning your own position to help me escape him? Julian slowed the sports car as the towering, sterile structure of St. Jude's private wing loomed into view at the end of the block. The massive building was bathed in harsh, artificial white light, a beacon of clinical efficiency, standing starkly against the dark, violent city. He pulled the vehicle into a shadowed alleyway adjacent to the loading docks, cutting the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was thick and deeply intimate. He turned fully in his seat, his highly observant, intelligent eyes locking onto mine, with an absolute, unshielded sincerity that took my breath away. Because my best friend is a monster who does not know how to love without suffocating the thing he desires, Julian said softly. His gaze dropped briefly to the angry red bruises blooming on my pale wrist. Marks like a necklace I never asked for, his jaw tightening with a fleeting echo of the violence he had displayed in the alcove. He saw your crushing financial anxiety, your exhaustion, the way you flinched at loud noises, and his first instinct was to lock you in a highly secure room and throw away the key. He thinks absolute protection requires complete possession, but in his desperate, overwhelming need to possess you, he terrifies you. The charismatic tactician reached out, his warm, elegant fingers gently resting over my trembling hands. The physical contact was grounding, lacking the heavy, overwhelming gravity of Dante's touch, but offering a deep, profound solidarity. You are the most brilliant, resilient woman I have ever met, Clara, Julian murmured, his voice a hushed confession in the dark cabin. You found a 3% discrepancy in the black leather ledger that took my best analysts 6 months to miss. You survived a coward's abuse. You navigated the inner sanctum of the most dangerous mafia don in Massachusetts without losing your professional dignity. You do not belong in a gilded cage. You deserve to operate in the light. And I promised myself I would help you find a way out of his shadow, even if it meant I had to play the villain in Dante's story to do it. A tight, painful knot formed in my throat. I had been entirely invisible for 2 years, fighting a solitary, agonizing war against medical debt and psychological trauma. I had relied entirely on my intellect to survive, but sitting in the quiet warmth of Julian's silver sports car, listening to the syndicate's underboss validate my sheer competence and fiercely defend my independence, a profound sense of relief washed over my exhausted soul. I am not negotiating the terms of my surrender, I whispered, adapting the fierce mandate I had established in the library, when I planned to hand Dante my forensic invoice, my spine straightening with renewed resolve. I am just trying to save my mother, and we are going to do exactly that, Julian promised, a sharp, confident smile returning to his aristocratic features. He picked up the modified tracking device from the console. The digital screen displayed a pulsing green dot rapidly approaching the hospital's rear entrance. The Syndicate Private Medical Transport Division is pulling into the loading bay right now, My men are already moving to the ICU floor. It is time to go steal a patient. I nodded, the paralyzing terror finally giving way to the cold, clinical precision of a professional auditor executing a flawless operation. I reached for the door handle, pushing the low door open and stepping out into the freezing winter night. The sleek midnight blue silk billowed around my legs as the biting wind tore through the alleyway. Julian reached into the car, pulling out his heavy emerald velvet coat, and draped it firmly over my shivering shoulders. I pulled the luxurious fabric tight, wrapped in a new armor of fierce determination. We moved quickly through the service entrance, bypassing the main security desk entirely. Julian badged us through the reinforced fire doors using a cloned keycard, his movements silent and predatory. The stark, fluorescent lights of the hospital corridors washed over us, highlighting the sharp contrast between his bespoke evening wear and the sterile medical environment. As we reached the service elevator, my mind automatically shifted into logistical analysis. I had spent countless hours in this facility, memorizing the shift rotations of the nursing staff, calculating the financial drain of every single IV bag and oxygen monitor, while desperately compiling data to survive Victor's extortion. I knew the exact layout of the private medical wing. The night charge nurse does her rounds at exactly 2:15 in the morning, I stated, my voice steadying, stripping away the panic and replacing it with pure, unfiltered competence. If your transport operatives move in right now, they have a 7-minute window before the central station monitors register the disconnection of the primary telemetry. Julian glanced down at me, a flicker of genuine respect lighting up his dark eyes. My personnel are equipped to spoof the telemetry data to the nurse's station. We will loop the feed, buying us 15 minutes. No. I countered immediately, shaking my head. The secondary crash cart system is hardwired. If you loop the wireless telemetry, the hardwired vitals monitor in the wall unit will throw an asynchronous error code. I noticed it during the billing audit last month. The manufacturer's firmware has a bug. If the discrepancy exceeds 3% variance, the alarm sounds. Julian stopped walking, his hand hovering over the elevator call button. You audited the medical equipment firmware? I audited the service invoices, I corrected, my analytical mind firing on all cylinders. They were billed for 3 emergency tech calls last quarter, all of them logged at night, all of them citing asynchronous data errors. It happens when a patient is transferred to transport without properly clearing the wall unit's cache. If your men just spoof the wireless feed, the whole floor is going to light up like a beacon, and the hospital will trigger an automatic lockdown. The underboss actually smiled. A sharp, brilliant expression of pure predatory approval. He tapped his earpiece. Transport unit, hold your breach. We have a logistical update from the architect. He looked back at me. Tell them exactly what to do, Clara. I did not hesitate. The exhaustion and fear that had paralyzed me all evening evaporated, replaced by the electric, humming energy of professional control. I leaned closer to the secure mic on his lapel. Transport unit, this is Clara Mercer. Do not disconnect the primary IV pump until you have manually engaged the standby mode on the wall-mounted vital module. Sequence is mute, standby, then disconnect. If you pull the leads first, the hardwired system will flag a false crash. You have exactly 4 minutes before the floor nurse returns to the desk. Execute. Copy that, a gruff, professional voice crackled back through the earpiece. Executing standby sequence now. The heavy metal doors of the service elevator slid open, and we stepped inside. As the car ascended toward the ICU floor, I watched the floor numbers tick upward, my heart hammering a steady, controlled rhythm. I was no longer a victim being shuffled between dangerous men. I was an active participant in my own survival. I was using my specific, hard-earned knowledge to orchestrate the most critical logistics transfer of my life. When the elevator doors opened onto the dimly lit intensive care floor, the operation was already in motion. 2 large men dressed in identical dark tactical gear were seamlessly maneuvering a specialized, ICU-equipped transport gurney out of my mother's room. The transition was flawless. No alarms sounded. No asynchronous errors flared on the central nurse's station. I rushed forward, my silk gown rustling against the linoleum, my breath catching as I held my mother. Martha Mercer was unconscious, resting peacefully amidst the array of portable medical equipment, her pale face serene. The suffocating weight of the financial and physical terror that Victor Cross had held over my head for a year suddenly shattered. She was safe. I had gotten her out. Vitals are stable. One of the tactical medics reported quietly, glancing at the portable monitors. "We are ready to move to the loading bay. The ambulance is prepped for the 2-hour drive to the private care facility in the Berkshires." Julian stepped beside me, his presence an immovable pillar of support. "You did it, Clara," he murmured softly. "You saved her." I reached out, my trembling fingers gently brushing a stray lock of gray hair from my mother's forehead. A profound, overwhelming wave of relief washed through my chest, displacing the cold anxiety that had lived there for so long. For the first time in 18 months, the crushing medical debt and the constant, paralyzing fear of Victor's extortion were rendered completely obsolete. But even as the transport operatives wheeled the gurney toward the service elevator, the heavy, vibrating hum of my cell phone shattered the quiet triumph of the moment. I pulled the device from the concealed pocket of the silk gown, my blood turning instantly to ice. The screen illuminated the dark hallway, displaying a single terrifying notification. A text message from Dante Alarico. "I am tracking the pulse of the city, Clara. And I am coming for what is mine." I stared at the glowing screen, the sheer, undeniable gravities of his mesmerization settling back onto my shoulders like a familiar, suffocating blanket. The mafia boss had not been slowed down by Julian's encrypted diversions. The apex predator was already hunting, tearing through the rain-slicked streets with a homicidal fury that would burn everything in its path. I pocketed the phone, my jaw clenching as I turned back to the underboss. I was no longer just a terrified secretary fleeing from a violently jealous boss. I was a hyper-competent survivor, and I was finally taking control of my own destiny. "He knows," I said quietly, the copper taste of fear and adrenaline sharp on my tongue. "Dante is coming." Julian's eyes hardened, his charismatic demeanor vanishing instantly beneath the cold, calculated exterior of the syndicate's second-in-command. He drew his weapon from a shoulder holster, racking the slide with a sharp, metallic clack that echoed loudly in the sterile hallway. "Then we do not have 20 minutes, Julian stated, his voice devoid of all warmth. "Move the gurney now." We sprinted toward the elevator, the heavy doors closing just as the distant, terrifying sound of shattered glass echoed from the lobby below. The absolute sanctuary I had sought was collapsing around me, replaced by the terrifying reality of a war I had just ignited. He was here. The service elevator plummeted toward the ground floor, the mechanical whir of the heavy steel cables whining loudly in the cramped, claustrophobic shaft. I pressed my spine flat against the cold metal wall, my lungs struggling to pull sufficient oxygen through the suffocating tension that had gripped my entire body. The descent felt endless, a vertical freefall into the criminal underworld I had spent my entire life avoiding. Every jolt of the elevator car sent a fresh spike of adrenaline straight into my marrow. The smell of antiseptic and old grease mixed in the confined space, a nauseating combination that threatened to push me into full somatic shock. The portable telemetry monitor attached to my mother's gurney beeped in a steady, synthetic rhythm, an unforgettable line of life amidst the total, catastrophic chaos I had just unleashed. Beside the gurney, Julian Sterling stood like a statue carved from pure, lethal intent. His charismatic, easygoing mask had entirely dissolved, replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a syndicate underboss, preparing for an imminent, violent collision. His shoulders were square, his breathing meticulously controlled. I realized then that Julian hadn't just prepared a car. He had prepared for a war. He knew Dante's psychological triggers better than anyone, and he had deliberately struck the match. The heavy pistol in his hand caught the harsh fluorescent light, a stark, physical reminder that my intellectual maneuvering had finally breached the threshold of open war. I wasn't just a forensic accountant anymore. I was a massive liability in a very deadly game. When the elevator doors slid apart, the transition was violently jarring. We were immediately hit by the freezing, damp air of the hospital's subterranean loading bay, thick with the smell of diesel exhaust and wet concrete. Puddles of oily water reflected the harsh overhead halogens, warping the light into sickly yellow shapes. The torrential rain outside battered the concrete overhang, creating a deafening roar that masked the sound of our frantic footsteps. The Syndicate Private Medical Transport Division, a heavily armored ambulance disguised as a standard emergency vehicle, sat idling with its rear doors wide open, the powerful engine thrumming impatiently. The red and white reflective decals were a masterclass in urban camouflage, designed to move critically wounded syndicate assets without generating a single police report or hospital intake form. The two tactical medics moved with terrifying efficiency, securing Martha Mercer's gurney into the specialized locking mechanisms bolted to the floor of the cabin. They operated in absolute silence, their faces obscured by dark balaclavas, entirely focused on stabilizing the intravenous drips swinging violently from the roof hooks. I watched the IV fluid slosh inside the plastic bags, a delicate lifeline suspended over an armored floor. Every second we lingered here increased the probability of Dante intercepting us. My mother looked so small, so devastatingly frail beneath the heavy thermal blankets, her pale skin stark against the tactical black interior of the transport. I climbed into the back, the sleek midnight blue silk of my gown zigging briefly on the diamond plate aluminum floorboards. The luxurious fabric, entirely inappropriate for a tactical medical extraction, was soaked with freezing rain in seconds, clinging beneath the velvet coat to my shivering skin like a layer of ice. Julian stepped up directly behind me, grabbing the heavy reinforced doors to pull them shut and seal us inside. But he hesitated for a fraction of a second. I followed his highly observant gaze through the narrow gap between the closing doors, peering down the long, dimly lit expanse of the loading bay. At the far end, the double-serviced doors we had just bypassed were violently blown off their hinges. They shattered outward, raining sharp debris across the wet concrete floor. The metallic screech of the tearing hinges cut cleanly through the roar of the thunderstorm, a horrific sound that paralyzed the air in my lungs. Through the settling dust and the blinding glare of the overhead security halogens, a singular massive silhouette emerged. Dante Alarico. He was a terrifying vision of an apex predator completely unchained. His dark bespoke suit jacket was gone. His dark dress shirt was soaked and clinging tightly to the heavy coiled muscles of his chest. His right hand was still visibly dripping blood from the shattered crystal tumbler, the crimson mixing freely with the rain puddles on the pavement. The heavy platinum signet ring, with the Alarico family crest, symbolizing his absolute authority and ownership, gleamed under the harsh light. Even from 100 feet away, the sheer, explosive velocity of his presence hit me like a physical shockwave. His iron-gray irises locked dead onto the rear of the ambulance, burning with a territorial fury that made my heart execute a painful, violent stutter against my ribs. He wasn't looking at Julian. He was looking at the emerald velvet coat Julian had draped over my shoulders. The sheer force of his jealousy was tangible. It radiated across the loading bay, heavy and suffocating. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He was the weapon. Dante took a single predatory stride forward, the water splashing against his boots. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. Julian's jaw tightened. He did not say a single word. He simply slammed the heavy armored doors shut, engaging the multi-point deadbolts with a resounding, airtight thud that instantly sealed us into the pressurized cabin. Drive. Julian commanded through the intercom to the front cab, his voice lacking all of its usual warmth. Do not stop for anything. The drive was a blur of flashing city lights and relentless panic. The heavy tires screeched against the wet pavement as we tore out of the loading bay and merged aggressively into the dark, chaotic streets of Boston. I collapsed heavily into the jump seat beside my mother, my trembling hands instinctively gripping the cold metal railing of her bed. The intense physical shock rippling through my central nervous system was agonizing. I had actively defied the most dangerous man in the city, and the haunting, devastating image of him standing in the rain, bleeding and furious, was permanently seared into my retinas. My chest ached with every shallow breath. Why did the sight of his bleeding hand twist my stomach into such violent knots? I was supposed to be running from him, securing my independence, yet the only thing my mind could process was the profound betrayal burning in his fierce, storm-like gaze. I watched the digital readouts on the portable monitors with obsessive focus, desperate to ensure the rapid physical transfer had not compromised her fragile stability. Her heart rate was slightly elevated, but the oxygen saturation remained steady at 96%. Small mercies in a catastrophic night. Julian sat on the opposite bench, his sidearm resting loosely on his knee, his intelligent eyes tracking the rearview camera feeds displayed on the mounted tablet. The glow from the screen illuminated the sharp angles of his face, casting deep shadows over his expression. The tension inside the armored cabin was thick enough to choke on. The rain hammered against the reinforced roof, sounding like gravel being thrown against the metal. We are taking a necessary detour, Julian finally announced, his tone steady, attempting to project a calm he clearly did not feel. We cannot risk the 2-hour drive to the Berkshires, with Dante actively tearing up the traffic grid. I am diverting us to a residential safe house. It is completely off the syndicate's primary ledgers. We will stabilize Martha there, swap the portable oxygen tanks for the heavy-duty cylinders, and wait for my secondary extraction team to clear a blind route. Is it safe? I asked, my voice cracking, the copper taste of fear still extremely sharp on my tongue. The emerald velvet coat felt incredibly heavy suddenly, a suffocating reminder of the jealousy I had deliberately provoked. It is fortified ballistic steel wrapped in suburban siding, Julian replied, his gaze flickering back to the monitor. Dante does not know it exists. You will be secure. 20 minutes later, the ambulance pulled into the attached garage of an unassuming, 2-story house nestled at the very back of a quiet, heavily wooded cul-de-sac. The residential safe house was a masterclass in visual deception. From the outside, it looked like a perfectly normal family home, complete with dormant winter flower beds and drawn curtains. Inside, it was a tactical bunker. The walls were reinforced with thick steel plating, the windows were bullet-resistant polymer, and the air smelled faintly of gun oil and filtered ozone. There were no family photos, no knickknacks, just the cold, sterile efficiency of a place designed solely to keep people alive when the world outside wanted them dead. The contrast between the mundane suburban exterior and the lethal interior made my skin crawl. The medics swiftly transferred my mother into a ground-floor bedroom that had been converted into a sterile triage center. They immediately began hooking her telemetry, leads to the heavier stationary power supplies. I stood in the doorway, my arms wrapped tightly around my waist, shivering violently in the damp midnight blue silk gown beneath the velvet coat. The absolute silence of the house was deeply unnerving, a stark contrast to the violent storm raging outside. It felt like a tomb, or a gilded cage. Julian walked into the living room, shedding his wet bespoke peacoat. He moved to the small kitchenette, pouring a glass of water and bringing it to me. Drink? He ordered gently, his observant eyes scanning my pale, exhausted face. You are in physical shock, Clara. Your breathing is entirely too shallow. We have bought ourselves a few hours. Let the medics do their job. I took the glass with trembling fingers, but before the water could even touch my lips, the entire foundation of the house shuddered. It was not thunder. It was a massive, concentrated kinetic impact. Julian spun toward the front entrance, instantly dropping his charismatic mask. His heavy pistol was up and leveled directly at the door in a fraction of a second. The heavy, reinforced steel core of the front door groaned in loud protest. A second impact hit, louder, more violent, carrying the unmistakable, terrifying force of a specialized breaching ram. My glass slipped from my freezing fingers, shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces on the hardwood floor, as the illusion of absolute sanctuary evaporated instantly. Step behind me, Julian snarled, his voice dropping into a lethal operational command register. I backed away, my spine hitting the hallway wall, my lungs completely forgetting how to draw air. The third impact tore the heavy door completely out of its reinforced frame. The wood and steel buckled horribly, the deadbolt snapping like dry twigs as the door crashed inward, letting the violent winter storm howl freely into the quiet living room. Dante Alarico stormed the safe house. He did not bring an army. He did not bring Silas Thorne or a tactical team. The king of the Boston underworld had come completely alone, driven by a primal consuming obsession that had thoroughly overridden his logical restraint. He was a terrifying, breathtaking force of nature. Rain poured heavily from his dark hair, his broad chest heaving beneath the soaked fabric of his ruined shirt. Blood from his right hand smeared across the white doorframe as he stepped inside, his heavy boots crunching loudly over the splintered wood. His commanding gray eyes bypassed Julian entirely, locking onto me with a possessive, territorial fury that consumed all the oxygen in the room. The scent of the storm, his dark cedar cologne, and fresh copper flooded the sterile air of the bunker. Dante, stand down, Julian warned, his voice calm but incredibly tense, the barrel of his sidearm aimed squarely at his oldest friend's chest. You are crossing a line you cannot uncross. She is terrified of you. Dante didn't even look at the weapon. He didn't flinch at the imminent threat of lethal force. He took a slow, highly deliberate step forward, the sheer gravitational pull of his massive frame suffocating the space between us. You think a piece of ballistic steel and a secret ledger can hide what is mine? Dante's voice was a dark, vibrating hum that rattled my bones. You think you can wrap her in your coat, Put her in your car and drive her out of my city? As he spoke, my heightened awareness caught a bright, blinking green light on the tactical radio harnessed to his chest. The encryption module, the small black device that scrambled syndicate communications, had been violently ripped off, exposing the raw wiring. In his homicidal rage to find me, Dante had destroyed the secure relay. Every single word he was speaking was currently being broadcasted over an open, unencrypted communication line, bouncing off the local civilian towers. Mr. Alarico, please, I whispered, stepping out slightly from behind Julian, my analytical mind demanding I try to de-escalate the explosive situation before someone was killed. Julian was only trying to protect my mother from Victor. I had to secure her extraction. Dante's gaze snapped to mine, the raw, unfiltered agony of his jealousy finally bleeding through his impenetrable mask. Protect her from Victor? I erased Victor. The moment I saw that coward's extortion email, I bought his debts. I liquidated his leverage. I paid the $89,000 to the clinic directly from my personal accounts. Victor Cross is a ghost, Clara. He is nothing. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath directly from my lungs. He had paid it. He had instantly, effortlessly wiped out the crushing mountain of medical debt that had suffocated me for 2 grueling years. My forensic brain stuttered, desperately trying to calculate the logistics of an $89,000 wire transfer executed at midnight. It was impossible to clear those funds without flagging federal oversight unless he had moved cash directly through the hospital's private banking division. He had cleared the board. He had dismantled my cage before I even realized the door was open. I didn't just want you auditing my ledgers, Dante screamed, his voice cracking with a terrifying, absolute devotion that completely shattered the quiet safe house. I noticed every time you flinched. I saw the bruises he left on you. I watched you bleed yourself dry trying to survive, and I built an entire empire just to make sure you never had to shiver in the cold again. You are not just my secretary. You are my goddamn world, Clara, and I will burn anyone who tries to take you away from me. His intense jealousy exposed everything. The calculated, ruthless mafia boss had stripped away all his armor, standing in the ruined doorway, bleeding and desperate, confessing his obsessive feelings with a raw, undeniable vulnerability that paralyzed me. I stared at him, at the blood dripping from his knuckles, at the sheer desperation in his slate-gray eyes. For 2 years I had been completely invisible, shrinking myself down to survive Victor's abuse and the crushing weight of my mother's illness. Now, the most dangerous man in the city was tearing himself apart because he couldn't stand the thought of losing me. Dante. Julian's voice broke the heavy silence, but the weapon in his hand had noticeably lowered. Julian wasn't looking at Dante's face. He was staring directly at the blinking green light on the ruined tactical radio strapped to Dante's chest. Your comms. The encryption module is gone. Dante blinked, the homicidal fog in his eyes clearing just enough to process Julian's words. He looked down at the exposed wiring. The green light pulsed steadily, broadcasting his absolute devotion into the stormy night. Before Dante could rip the ruined radio from his vest, a secondary tactical scanner sitting on the safe house's command console suddenly flared to life. The automated encryption protocols must have been scanning the local area for unauthorized transmission spikes. It wasn't Dante's voice coming through the tinny speaker. It was a chaotic burst of static, followed by the harsh, panicked chatter of a local, unencrypted civilian frequency. Heard the whole thing. The Alarico boss is broadcasting on an open mic. He just admitted Clara Mercer is his weakness. The voice on the scanner was breathless, desperate, and entirely too familiar. It was one of the rented mercenaries from the charity gala. Victor's hired muscle. They were using cheap, off-the-shelf police scanners, and Dante's violent destruction of his own encryption module had basically handed them the keys to the kingdom. A cold dread poured into my veins, instantly neutralizing the warmth of Dante's confession. The broadcast. When Dante had screamed his devotion, when he had declared I was his world, and Julian had mentioned the safe house perimeter, the entire conversation had bounced off the local towers. Did you receive the coordinates? Another rough voice crackled over the scanner, the audio distorted by the heavy rain hitting their windshield. Yeah. The underboss slipped up. We know exactly where the residential safe house is. Victor is tripling the payout. He says Alarico left his tactical teams behind. He's alone. We hit them now, we take the girl and the mother. We own the Alarico syndicate. The transmission cut off, returning to a low, hissing static that sounded louder than a bomb going off in the quiet room. I stopped breathing entirely. Victor. He wasn't a ghost. By erasing Victor's debts, Dante had inadvertently backed a cornered rat into a position of ultimate desperation. And, in his blind, jealous rage to reach me, Dante had handed Victor the exact coordinates and the ultimate leverage to destroy him. My analytical mind began spinning rapidly, processing the data points. Victor had no combat training. He was a coward who hid behind legal threats and proxy signatures. The men in those vans were hired guns, motivated purely by greed, lacking the deep, fanatical loyalty of the Alarico syndicate. That made them unpredictable, but it also made them fundamentally sloppy. Julian cursed violently in Italian, abandoning his sidearm to rush toward the console. His fingers flew across the mounted tablet, pulling up the exterior perimeter feeds. They are mobilizing. I have 3 unmarked surveillance vans entering the cul-de-sac. They heard everything, Dante. They know you are unprotected. Dante didn't flinch. The raw vulnerability of his confession instantly evaporated, replaced by the terrifying familiar ice of the Alarico dawn. He reached up and ripped the broken tactical radio from his vest, tossing it onto the floor, and crushing it under the heel of his boot. He stepped fully into the room, kicking the splintered remains of the front door aside. They think I am unprotected because Silas Thorne and my tactical teams are 2 miles away, Dante stated coldly, his rigid, steely stare locked onto the dark hallway. They think I am vulnerable. We have 2 medics and a patient on heavy life support, I interjected, the pragmatic, highly analytical forensic accountant in me forcibly overriding my instinctual terror. I stepped forward, no longer hiding behind Julian, letting the emerald velvet coat slip off my shoulders to pool on the floor. I didn't need Julian's protection anymore. I was looking at the man who had just bought my freedom with $89,000 and a ruined door. The exterior ballistic steel will hold against small arms fire, but the front entrance is completely compromised. If they have a breaching ram, they will flood the ground floor in under 90 seconds. Dante's eyes tracked my movement, a dark flare of pride cutting through his lethal focus, as he watched me shift from a terrified victim into a strategic asset. The panic that had paralyzed me only moments ago was completely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating efficiency that made me exceptional at my job. I didn't survive 2 years of Victor's abuse by being weak. I survived by outthinking him. You analyzed the structural integrity of the safe house? I analyze ledgers, Mr. Alarico. A physical breach is just a logistical deficit, I replied, my voice steadying, the trembling in my fingers finally ceasing. Julian, the external camera feeds, I commanded, moving to stand beside him at the console. The intricate mapping of the security software reflected in my eyes. Pull up the thermal imaging overlay. If they are using rented surveillance vans, the engine blocks will read hot. We can isolate their approach vectors and force them into a tactical bottleneck at the driveway's narrowest point. Julian tapped the screen, glancing at me with a newfound, profound respect. Thermal is up. You are right. 2 hot engines idling on the left flank, one moving aggressively up the center. They are trying to box us in. The front door is a fatal funnel, Dante stated, his voice devoid of all warmth as he pulled a spare, fully loaded magazine from his vest and slapped it into his sidearm with a sharp metallic click. The sound was deafening in the tense silence. Let them stack up on the porch. The ballistic paneling on the interior hallway creates a ricochet trap. If they step over that threshold, they step into a crossfire. Victor Cross is a coward who thinks he can use my own obsession against me. He walked toward me, closing the distance until the heat radiating from his soaked, massive frame enveloped me completely. The scent of rain, dark cedar, and the copper of blood was intoxicating, grounding my frayed senses. He didn't touch me. He never touched me without permission, a profound display of restraint that sharply contrasted the violence he was about to unleash. He looked down at my face, tracing the faint outline of the fading bruise on my jawline with his eyes. In my world, when I claim something as mine, I protect it absolutely, Dante murmured. His register shifting to a dark, vibrating hum meant only for me amidst the impending war. Victor thought he heard a weakness on that radio. I am going to show him exactly what happens when you threaten the woman who holds my ledgers. He turned his back to the shattered door, facing the dark, rain-swept street where a dozen armed mercenaries were rapidly approaching. Julian, contact Silas on the encrypted satellite line. Tell him to box the street. Nobody leaves this cul-de-sac alive. The silence stretching across the fortified living room of the residential safe house was unnaturally dense, a pressurized vacuum waiting for a single, catastrophic spark. Outside, the torrential winter storm continued to batter the shattered remnants of the front door, freezing wind howling through the twisted steel frame and violently scattering the white drywall dust across the hardwood floor. But inside the bunker, the air tasted entirely of ozone, gun oil, and the sharp, undeniable copper of impending violence. I stood rigid beside the heavy command console, my eyes locked on the glowing thermal imaging overlay. My physical hypervigilance, usually a source of paralyzing, freezing terror, had miraculously crystallized into a state of hyper-focused clarity. I was no longer a helpless victim, waiting for the next blow in the dark. I was the logistical anchor in a tactical defense. I watched the bright red heat signatures cluster aggressively on the digital map. 12 distinct targets. They were moving without any semblance of military precision, their spacing entirely too tight, driven blindly by the reckless greed Victor Cross had ignited in them. 3 advancing up the concrete steps, I announced, my voice slicing cleanly through the heavy, suffocating silence. I kept my tone completely devoid of panic, channeling the exact same clinical detachment I used when auditing the syndicate's complex offshore routing numbers. They are attempting to breach simultaneously. 2 more are flanking the shattered doorframe, hugging the exterior brickwork to avoid the sightlines. Dante did not look back at me. He stood perfectly still in the center of the hallway, his massive, rain-soaked frame forming an impenetrable physical barrier between the compromised entrance and the sterile triage room where my mother lay hooked to her fragile telemetry. He held his heavy sidearm with a relaxed, lethal proficiency, his sharp, predatory eyes scanning the dark threshold. Julian Sterling mirrored him on the opposite side of the fatal funnel, utilizing the reinforced corner of the kitchen wall for cover. His bespoke charcoal suit was ruined with water and dust, but his charismatic, easygoing composure had been completely replaced by the cold, calculating executioner of the Alarico Empire. "Wait for the threshold cross," Dante ordered, his voice a low, guttural vibration that carried effortlessly over the roaring storm. "Let them commit." The first mercenary stepped aggressively through the splintered doorway, a heavy assault rifle raised, blinded by the driving rain and the fatal assumption of an unprotected target. He didn't even have the time to register the ricochet trap they had stepped into. Dante fired. The sound in the enclosed, ballistic steel-lined space was absolutely deafening. A physical concussive wave that violently punched the air directly from my lungs. The mercenary dropped instantly, neutralized before his finger could even flinch against the trigger. The brutal, instantaneous violence broke the fragile psychological dam of the attackers. Complete chaos erupted. Automatic gunfire tore blindly into the safe house, the high-velocity bullets striking the reinforced interior walls with terrifying metallic screeches. The ballistic paneling Julian had installed held flawlessly, absorbing and redirecting the massive kinetic energy exactly as designed. Sparks showered the hardwood floor, illuminating the dark hallway in brief, violent flashes of strobe light. The acrid smell of cordite instantly overpowered the familiar scent of winter cedar, burning my nostrils and stinging my eyes with its chemical harshness. I dropped to a tight crouch behind the solid steel-reinforced desk supporting the command console, my fingers flying rapidly across the touchscreen to adjust the external camera angles as the porch lights were shot out one by one. The digital thermal feed was my only window into the escalating war, the glowing red blobs shifting frantically as the mercenaries realized they were entirely outmatched by the 2 syndicate veterans. "They are pulling back to the porch pillars," I shouted over the deafening roar of sustained gunfire, my analytical mind automatically calculating their compromised lines of sight based on the architectural blueprints Julian had displayed. "Julian, you have a blind spot on your left flank. One target is trying to angle a shot through the shattered side window." Julian didn't question my logistics. He trusted the forensic accountant's spatial calculation implicitly, treating my data as absolute gospel. He pivoted smoothly, firing 2 suppressed shots directly through the drywall into the specified trajectory. A heavy thud sounded from the porch outside as the bright heat signature on my screen abruptly vanished into the dark. "Good call, Clara," Julian yelled back, smoothly ejecting a spent magazine and slapping a fresh one home with a sharp metallic clack. But the mercenaries were desperate. Victor's promise of a massive, Syndicate-level payout had pushed them past the point of rational self-preservation. 2 more men threw themselves recklessly through the ruined doorway, laying down a wild, suppressive spray of bullets that forced Dante to step back slightly. The sheer volume of incoming fire was tearing the decorative drywall to shreds, filling the air with a thick, choking cloud of white gypsum dust that coated my elegant formal dress in a ghostly layer. Dante moved with a predatory, terrifying grace that completely defied his massive size. He was a force of nature, coldly and systematically dismantling the threat with surgical precision. But as he eliminated the targets pushing the hallway, I saw a new, highly coordinated cluster of red heat signatures appearing at the bottom edge of the digital screen. "Silas," I breathed, my heart hammering a frantic, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. The encrypted satellite message had finally reached the primary enforcer. Silas Thorne and the Alarico tactical teams had arrived at the entrance of the cul-de-sac. The tactical map showed their heat signatures fanning out with flawless, terrifying military precision, instantly boxing the mercenary vans into a lethal, inescapable crossfire. The heavy, rhythmic thud of suppressed tactical rifles began to echo clearly from the street, entirely different from the chaotic, undisciplined spray of the mercenaries. The hunters had officially become the hunted. "Silas is closing the net," I called out, frantically wiping a thick layer of white drywall dust from my eyes. "The perimeter is fully secured. The remaining targets on the porch are abandoning the breach and retreating toward their vehicles." "They are not leaving," Dante growled, his slate-gray eyes burning with an unyielding, homicidal fury. He stepped forward, advancing directly into the kill zone of the ruined doorway to ensure total liquidation. He was abandoning his cover, driven by the absolute, consuming need to permanently erase the men who had dared to threaten his territory and his people. It was a calculated risk for a man who believed himself completely invincible, but variables in a firefight were notoriously, dangerously unstable. My eyes darted back to the thermal screen just as a lone, isolated heat signature flared brightly on the far right edge of the display. It was a mercenary who had bypassed the fatal funnel of the front porch entirely, scaling the low wooden trellis on the side of the house during the initial chaos. He was currently positioned directly outside the narrow ballistic glass window of the ground floor triage room. The window was bullet-resistant polymer, but it was absolutely not rated to withstand sustained, concentrated automatic fire from point-blank range. And directly behind that window was Martha Mercer, lying entirely helpless on a gurney, connected to a fragile labyrinth of life-saving telemetry. "Dante, the triage room window!" I screamed, the clinical detachment instantly shattering, replaced by a raw, primal terror that tore violently from my throat. The mercenary outside raised his heavy weapon, the dark barrel pressing directly against the thick polymer glass. The first burst of automatic fire spider-webbed the window instantly, the structural integrity failing under the concentrated kinetic impact, with a loud, sickening crack. I didn't calculate the physical risk to my own fragile body. The fierce, unyielding instinct of a daughter who had sacrificed everything, enduring Victor's abuse, carrying $89,000 in crushing debt, and infiltrating a mafia empire, just to keep her mother breathing completely overrode my survival programming. I scrambled out from behind the heavy console, throwing myself across the open hallway directly toward the triage room doors. I was completely exposed. I was moving right into the trajectory of the failing glass. Dante's head snapped toward the sound of the shattering window, and my desperate, terrified scream. The apex predator, who had been completely focused on executing his enemies on the porch, realized the catastrophic vulnerability unfolding behind him. He didn't yell. He didn't hesitate. Dante Alarico threw his massive muscular frame across the hallway, intercepting my path with a violent, overwhelming physical force. He didn't just push me out of the way. He engulfed me entirely, wrapping his broad, powerful arms around my shoulders and twisting his torso in midair to place his back squarely between my fragile frame and the failing window. The ballistic glass instantly gave way with a deafening, catastrophic crash, a shower of jagged, glittering shards raining into the triage room just as the mercenary fired blindly through the breach. I felt the violent, physical shudder rock Dante's massive body. A sharp, sickening grunt escaped his lips, a terrible sound of compressed air and sudden, profound physical trauma. The engraved silver-white band scraped harshly against the floorboards as we crashed hard onto the hardwood, his immense weight driving every ounce of breath from my lungs. For a single agonizing second, the world narrowed entirely to the terrifying heat of his body pressing me into the floor. The familiar scent of his expensive cedar cologne was suddenly, violently overpowered by the fresh, hot, metallic stench of his blood. Above us, the deafening roar of a heavy-caliber weapon silenced the threat at the window permanently. Julian had stepped smoothly into the hallway, firing 3 precise, lethal shots through the shattered frame, neutralizing the flanking mercenary instantly. Outside, the gunfire abruptly ceased. Silas Thorne's tactical team had completely liquidated the remaining targets in the cul-de-sac. The war was officially over, but in the suffocating, dust-filled silence that followed, all I could hear was the ragged, uneven rasp of Dante's breathing directly beside my ear. "Dante," I gasped, my voice fracturing into a terrified sob as I struggled frantically to push myself up from the floorboards. The expensive midnight blue silk was entirely ruined, covered in white drywall dust and the dark, wet, expanding smear of his blood. "Dante, let me up, please," he groaned, a low, guttural sound of immense physical effort, rolling slowly off me to lie flat on his back. His dark dress shirt was soaked, the expensive fabric torn violently at the left side of his abdomen, just below the ribs. Thick, dark blood was welling up rapidly, pooling onto the ruined hardwood and staining the white dust. He had taken a bullet. The untouchable king of the Boston underworld, the man who moved entire shipping fleets and dictated the lives of thousands with a single signature, had thrown his body into the path of automatic gunfire, simply to shield me from the kinetic impact. The physical shock vanished from my veins, instantly replaced by the practiced medical logistics I had been forced to master over 2 years of managing Martha's intensive care. I scrambled to my knees, pressing my bare, trembling hands directly over the bleeding wound. The intense heat of his blood was a terrifying, deeply grounding anchor. "Julian, bring the trauma kit from the triage room," I barked, my voice completely stripped of its previous panic, ringing with the unbreakable authority of a woman fighting for a life. "He is bleeding heavily, but the exit wound is visible against the floor. It missed the primary organs. It's a through-and-through lateral strike." Julian was there in seconds, dropping a heavy medical bag onto the floor beside me. His aristocratic face was unusually pale, the charismatic, unbothered underboss utterly stripped of his humor as he looked down at his bleeding friend. "I have the sutures and the pressure dressings, Clara," Julian said, his hands moving quickly and efficiently to assist me in applying the heavy gauze pads to the wound. "I am fine," Dante grated out, his jaw clenched so tightly the prominent muscles trembled under the skin. His right hand, still bruised and cut from where he had shattered the crystal glass on the balcony, reached up to firmly grip my wrist. His strength was still terrifyingly present, his intense gray irises finding the small security camera, locking onto my face with a burning, possessive intensity that completely defied his physical injury. "Are you hit, Clara? Did the glass touch you?" "I am not hit," I whispered, my vision finally blurring with unshed tears, my hands pressing firmly against the thick gauze on his side to stem the blood flow. "Because you shielded me. You took a bullet meant for the room." "In my world," Dante breathed, his broad chest heaving with exertion, his thumb weakly but deliberately brushing the frantic pulse point on my wrist. "I protect what is mine absolutely. I told you this. You do not bleed while I am standing." Julian tightened the pressure dressing, securing it rapidly with heavy medical tape. The bleeding was already beginning to slow, the thick, heavy tactical muscle of Dante's abdomen having effectively deflected the worst of the bullet's kinetic velocity. "You are a stubborn, dangerously jealous fool, Dante," Julian murmured, his voice heavy with a profound mix of relief and lingering, justified anger. "You nearly got yourself killed tonight because you let your obsession entirely blind your tactical logic." Dante's eyes shifted slowly from me to his underboss, the lethal, cold authority returning to his gaze despite the heavy blood loss. "You took her from my estate, Julian. You dressed her in your velvet coat and put her in your car in front of the cartel. You orchestrated a massive public betrayal. I orchestrated an extraction you were too blind and suffocating to authorize." Julian fired back, refusing to back down, the deep, complex history of their childhood friendship fueling his defiance. He sat back on his heels, the ruined drywall dust clinging to his expensive bespoke trousers. "Look at her, Dante. Really look at the woman holding your encrypted ledgers. She didn't want my money. I offered her a blank offshore check in the library to run away from Victor Cross, and you, and she pushed it right back into my chest. She explicitly refused to trade one mafia cage for another. Dante's brow furrowed, a flicker of genuine, startling confusion cutting through the haze of his physical pain. He looked back at me, his gaze intensely searching my tear-streaked face for the truth. She orchestrated this entire medical transport, using the forensic consulting fee she demanded from you for finding the 3% discrepancy. Julian continued, his voice dropping into a solemn, heavy register that echoed in the quiet hallway. She didn't betray you. She didn't leave you for me. She used my logistics to save her mother. Because she thought your violent jealousy would prevent her from protecting Martha legally. Victor Cross was threatening to expose her proxy status to the state medical board within 48 hours. If you had just stopped acting like a possessive monster and actually listened to her, you would have seen she was trying to protect your syndicate from a massive federal incident. The words hung in the quiet, dust-filled air of the safe house, heavy and absolute. I kept my hands pressed firmly against Dante's side, feeling the steady, powerful, reassuring thud of his heart beneath my palms. I didn't look away from his slate-gray eyes. I let him see the raw, unvarnished truth of my existence. The deep exhaustion, the fierce independence, and the terrifying, unbidden affection that was beginning to root itself in the very center of my chest. I wasn't running from you, Mr. Alarico, I whispered, my voice trembling slightly, but carrying a core of unbreakable steel. I was running to secure the only family I have left. I didn't want Julian. I just wanted my mother to be safe. And I didn't know how to ask a king to step aside so a forensic accountant could do her job. Dante stared at me, the profound, staggering realization washing over his harsh, aristocratic features. The violent, consuming jealousy that had driven him to shatter glass, destroy his own encryption radio, and storm a fortified safe house entirely alone finally evaporated. In its place was a deep, quiet, overwhelming awe. He saw me, not as a fragile secretary to be locked away in a gilded cage for her own protection, but as a highly efficient survivor who had actively engineered her own salvation. He let his head fall back against the hardwood floor, a harsh, humorless laugh escaping his lips, morphing quickly into a wince of pain. A forensic invoice, he muttered, his deep voice vibrating through his broad chest. You used my own missing 3% to fund a black ops, medical extraction right under my nose. It was fair market value for syndicate-level auditing, I replied, a fragile, exhausted smile finally pulling at the corners of my mouth. Julian let out a long, slow breath, the aggressive tension finally bleeding completely out of the underboss. She is terrifying, Dante. I highly suggest you stop treating her like property and start treating her like a partner, before she audits the rest of your empire and buys it out from under you. Dante didn't argue. He slowly raised his uninjured left hand, his calloused fingers reaching up to gently cup my cheek. The touch was incredibly tender, entirely devoid of the overwhelming, suffocating gravity he usually projected when he felt his control slipping. It was the deliberate touch of a man who had finally realized that true protection did not require walls. Victor Cross is gone, Clara, Dante murmured softly, his rough thumb tracing my cheekbone, wiping away a smear of white drywall dust. The debt is fully liquidated. The private medical facility in the Berkshires is already secured under your name. You never have to hide a single ledger or a single fear from me again. I leaned heavily into his warm palm, the intense heat of his skin providing the ultimate anchor my frayed nerves so desperately craved. The cold, hyper-vigilant exhaustion that had defined my life, for 2 years finally shattered completely, replaced by a deeply grounded, warm, and absolute peace. The winter storm outside continued to rage against the ballistic steel of the safe house, but inside, wrapped in the steady heat of his presence and the fierce, unconditional devotion of the most dangerous man in the city, the cold could no longer reach me. Silas is securing the perimeter, Julian noted quietly, standing up and brushing the heavy dust from his ruined suit. He looked down at us, a charismatic, deeply knowing smile returning to his face. I will have the medics move Dante to a secure bed in the back room. It seems our executive secretary has officially promoted herself. I kept my hands pressed firmly to Dante's side, my analytical mind finally quiet, my heart completely surrendered to the chaotic, violent, and utterly safe world I had just claimed. The triage room was a suffocating bubble of medical antiseptic, and the heavy, undeniable scent of ozone. The combat medics Julian had stationed in the safe house worked with clinical, ruthless efficiency, their gloved hands moving rapidly under the harsh fluorescent overheads to seal the through-and-through bullet wound in Dante's left side. I stood in the doorway, my fingers gripping the steel doorframe so tightly my knuckles ached. Everything had shifted so violently in the span of a few hours. The absolute devastation of Victor's lingering threat felt pale compared to the reality of the bleeding mafia boss sitting before me. A man who had just dismantled his own empire's defenses to guarantee my mother's safety. I had discarded the shredded midnight blue silk gown, replacing it with an oversized black tactical sweater I found in the bunker's supply closet. The heavy wool offered physical warmth, but it did absolutely nothing to thaw the freezing adrenaline still trapped deep inside my marrow. Dante Alarico sat on the edge of the sterile examination table, his broad, heavily muscled chest rising and falling in measured, controlled breaths that completely belied the severe physical trauma he had just sustained. He refused the local anesthetic. He simply stared straight ahead, his slate-gray eyes locked onto the dark hallway, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles feathered beneath his skin. His Alarico signet ring on his right hand was completely coated in dried blood, a stark, visceral reminder of the shattered crystal on the balcony and the violent crossfire he had just thrown himself into to save me. "The internal suturing is complete, boss," the lead medic murmured, securing a thick, heavy pressure bandage around Dante's torso. "But the kinetic shock to your obliques requires immediate immobility. If you tear these stitches, the internal hemorrhaging will compromise your liver. You need at least 48 hours of absolute bed rest." Dante did not look at the medic. He simply reached down, his large, calloused fingers gripping the edge of his discarded, blood-soaked dress shirt, and casually tossed it aside. "Silas," Dante called out, his deep, gravelly voice entirely stripped of exhaustion, vibrating with a dark, lethal authority that instantly paralyzed the air in the small room. The primary enforcer stepped out of the shadows of the hallway, his tactical vest dusted with white drywall powder from the shootout. Here, the men on the porch were rented muscle. The syndicate kingpin stated coldly, sliding off the examination table. The medics instinctively stepped back, entirely unwilling to physically restrain the apex predator of the Boston underworld. Dante stood to his full imposing height. A sharp, ragged intake of breath hissed through his clenched teeth, his jaw tightening into a brutal line as his left hand instinctively twitched toward the fresh bandages. He locked his knees, ruthlessly forcing the physical agony down until his posture was nothing but terrifying, unbreakable authority. Victor Cross orchestrated the breach. He heard my open transmission. He knows I am out here, and he knows exactly what I value. If he is stupid enough to hire mercenaries to attack a fortified bunker, he is desperate enough to try again. He turned his steely, unyielding gaze to the lead medic. "Hit me with the highest dose of clinical pain blockers you have. Now." The medic hesitated under the crushing weight of the dawn's glare before hurriedly preparing a syringe of heavy synthetic opiates, injecting it directly into Dante's shoulder. As the powerful narcotics flooded his system, a violent tremor racked Dante's massive frame. His knees threatened to buckle under the catastrophic physical trauma. Silas Thorne moved with silent, immediate loyalty, stepping close to wedge his thick shoulder firmly under Dante's uninjured arm. Dante leaned heavily into his primary enforcer, relying entirely on Silas's physical support just to remain standing, yet his iron-gray eyes remained terrifyingly lucid. He was actively preparing to launch a tactical raid on a shattered abdomen. "Dante, you are actively bleeding," Julian Sterling interjected, leaning casually against the doorframe beside me. The underboss crossed his arms over his ruined bespoke charcoal suit, his highly observant eyes tracking the fresh crimson slowly seeping into the edges of the white gauze. "The threat in the cul-de-sac is permanently liquidated. My secondary extraction teams are clearing the asphalt as we speak. Victor is a coward holding an empty hand. Lie down before you tear your abdominal wall in half. Victor Cross is breathing the same air as Clara," Dante replied softly, turning his piercing territorial gaze directly toward me. The overwhelming gravity of his obsession hit me like a physical shockwave. He stepped forward, closing the distance between us until the intoxicating scent of winter cedar and sharp copper enveloped my senses. "He knows her mother's medical vulnerabilities. He put marks on her skin like a necklace she never asked for. I erased his financial leverage, but I did not erase him. That changes tonight." My heart executed a violent, painful stutter against my ribs. The forensic accountant inside me, The pragmatic, highly logical survivor who had spent 2 years analyzing risk and mitigating disaster, knew exactly what he was about to do. He was going to launch a final, devastating raid. He was going to permanently eliminate the antagonist who had made my life a living hell. "You do not know where he is," I whispered, forcing myself to hold his intense gaze, refusing to step back from his overwhelming heat. "Victor is a parasite, Mr. Alarico. He operates in the shadows." The moment his mercenaries failed to report back, he would have panicked and gone underground. "You cannot hunt a ghost with a torn abdomen." Dante reached out, his uninjured hand gently cupping the side of my neck. His thumb brushed a steady, grounding rhythm against my racing pulse point. "Then you are going to find him for me, Clara. You found the missing 3% in my encrypted logistics ledgers. You orchestrated a flawless medical extraction from a heavily monitored ICU. Find the rat." I stared up at him, the heavy, unspoken weight of his absolute trust settling directly over my shoulders. He was not ordering me to step aside. He was not locking me in a safe room while he fought the war. He was handing me the strategic reins of his empire, validating my sheer intellectual competence as the ultimate weapon in his arsenal. I turned away from his touch, the adrenaline in my veins instantly shifting from somatic terror into a cold, hyper-focused operational clarity. I walked swiftly into the ruined living room, stepping over the shattered remnants of the ballistic glass, and took my seat at the safe house's command console. "Victor is a severe gambling addict," I stated, my fingers flying rapidly across the illuminated touchscreen, bringing up the secure encrypted browser Julian had integrated into the network. "He doesn't have the discipline to stockpile physical cash. If he is running, he needs immediate liquid capital. He will have to access his offshore bookie accounts to secure a flight out of Massachusetts." I bypassed the standard firewalls, utilizing the syndicate's elite routing software to mirror Victor's known financial credentials. The digital footprint was incredibly sloppy. A desperate, frantic scattering of IP pings that a first-year accounting student could have tracked. The coward was hemorrhaging data in his panic. "He just initiated a massive wire transfer request," I announced, my eyes scanning the cascading lines of green code. 80 seconds ago. "He is trying to pull $50,000 from a heavily leveraged account linked to the Andrangheta sports betting rings. But the routing protocol requires a static IP verification for sums over 10,000. "Where is the ping originating from?" Silas asked, stepping up to the edge of the desk, his massive frame radiating lethal readiness as he checked the magazine of his heavy tactical rifle. I cross-referenced the IP address with the Boston Municipal Zoning Grid, the geographical overlay instantly locking onto a specific, isolated coordinate. The industrial waterfront. It's an abandoned commercial laundering compound near the old harbor docks that the local bookies use as a temporary clearinghouse. He is hiding in the basement office, waiting for the wire transfer to clear. "It won't clear," Julian noted smoothly, stepping up beside me and tapping a secondary command into the console. "I just blacklisted his routing number across the entire Eastern Seaboard network. He is locked in that basement with nothing left." Dante walked into the living room, having pulled a dark, heavy tactical jacket over his bandages. He looked like the physical embodiment of the Grim Reaper. A cold, calculated executioner stripped of his corporate restraint. He checked the slide of his sidearm, the sharp, metallic clack echoing with terrifying finality in the quiet room. "Stay on the safe house's command console, Clara," Dante commanded, his voice dropping into a dark, vibrating hum. "Tap into the municipal CCTV grid surrounding the harbor compound. I want real-time logistical overwatch. You guide us in." "Understood," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, embracing the sovereign partnership he was finally offering. 10 minutes later, the armored SUV tore out of the cul-de-sac, leaving Julian and me alone in the fortified bunker. The storm outside had finally begun to break, the torrential rain reducing to a cold, persistent drizzle. I sat perfectly still in the ergonomic chair, a dual-screen headset resting over my ears, my eyes locked on the digital feeds. In the agonizingly quiet minutes it took for them to cross the city, the sheer magnitude of the night finally caught up with me. Dante had thrown himself in front of a bullet intended for my family. The most ruthless man in the Boston underworld had bled for my mother, exposing his own vulnerability to guarantee my freedom. He wasn't just offering me safety. He was tearing down the bars of my gilded cage with his bare, bloodied hands. I took a deep, shuddering breath, locking the overwhelming surge of devotion away into a neat, secure mental compartment. There would be time to process his sacrifice later. Right now, he needed my eyes. I successfully hacked into the outdated security mainframe of the abandoned laundering compound. The grainy black and white night vision camera feeds flooded my left monitor, revealing the decaying, concrete architecture of the warehouse. I have visual on the perimeter. I spoke clearly into the secure microphone, my forensic mind mapping the spatial logistics of the compound. Silas? There are 2 armed lookouts smoking near the primary loading dock on the east elevation. Dante, the basement stairwell is clear. The structural blueprints show a reinforced steel door at the bottom of the steps. That is his bolt hole. Copy that, Dante's voice crackled through my earpiece, low and perfectly calm, devoid of the chaotic jealousy that had driven him earlier in the evening. He was back in his element. He was the apex predator executing a flawless hunt. Through the camera feed, I watched the violent poetry of the Alarico syndicate unfold. Silas Thorne moved like a massive lethal shadow, neutralizing the 2 lookouts on the loading dock with suppressed, surgical precision before they could even drop their cigarettes. The perimeter was secured in exactly 14 seconds. On the secondary camera, I saw Silas temporarily brace Dante against the exterior brickwork, allowing the syndicate boss a crucial second to let the heavy synthetic opiates fully mask the catastrophic pain of his torn abdomen. Dante gave a sharp, definitive nod, pushing away from his enforcer's support. He entered the main warehouse floor. Despite the severe trauma to his abdominal wall, he moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, his sidearm raised, his icy stare scanning the dark, cavernous space. He bypassed the rusting industrial washing machines, moving directly toward the narrow concrete stairwell I had identified. He is behind the steel door. Dante, I whispered over the comms, my heart hammering a steady, controlled rhythm. The thermal imaging shows a single heat signature pacing frantically in the center of the room. I have it, Dante murmured. I switched the feed to the internal camera mounted in the corner of the basement office. The image flickered, illuminating Victor Cross. The man who had terrorized me, who had manipulated my mother's illness to bleed me dry, looked pathetic. He was sweating profusely, his cheap suit wrinkled and stained, aggressively hitting the keys of a cracked laptop as he desperately tried to force the blocked wire transfer through the syndicate's firewall. The heavy steel door of the office did not just open. It was violently kicked off its rusting hinges, the metal screaming in protest as it slammed into the concrete wall. Through the camera feed, I saw Dante's broad shoulders momentarily seize. A brutal, visceral flinch tore through his posture as the kinetic shock ripped at his sutures, a flash of pure physical agony tightening his jaw, but he didn't stop. He pushed through the pain with terrifying, inhuman resolve. Victor jumped violently, knocking the laptop onto the floor. He spun around, his eyes widening in sheer primal horror as Dante Alarico stepped into the small, claustrophobic room. Dante did not rush, he did not yell. He walked slowly toward the center of the office, the sheer gravitational pull of his presence suffocating the ambient air. His tactical jacket hung open, revealing the thick white bandages wrapped tightly around his torso. A stark visual confirmation of the extreme violence he was willing to endure. Every step he took must have been agonizing, a brutal test of endurance against the tearing of his own flesh, but his face remained a flawless, terrifying mask of lethal intent. Alarico, Victor stammered, scrambling backward until his spine hit the damp concrete wall. He raised his hands in a frantic, pathetic gesture of surrender. Wait. Listen to me. The men at the safe house. That was a misunderstanding. Bookies forced my hand. I didn't want to hurt Clara. I just needed the money to clear my debts. Dante stopped exactly 3 feet away from the cowering man. The mafia boss looked down at Victor with an expression of such profound, icy disgust it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, even through the digital monitor. You do not speak her name. Dante's voice vibrated through the audio feed, a lethal, guttural command that stripped Victor of his last shred of humanity. You do not breathe the same air she breathes. You thought you could use her mother as a bargaining chip. You thought you could hide behind legal proxies and extortion emails to threaten what belongs absolutely to me. I'll sign the proxy away, Victor begged, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch, tears of genuine terror streaming down his face. I'll transfer the guardianship right now. You can have her. Just let me walk out of here. The absolute silence that followed was heavier than a physical blow. Dante slowly raised his sidearm, the dark, suppressed barrel leveling directly at the center of Victor's chest. The calculated intensity in Dante's eyes was the exact same look he had when auditing a fatally flawed ledger. He was simply erasing a deficit. "You do not have the authority to give me anything," Dante stated softly, the absolute sovereignty of his protection ringing clearly through the earpiece. "She earned her own freedom. I am just balancing the books." The suppressed gunshot was a sharp, brief hiss over the audio feed. Victor Cross collapsed instantly, sliding down the damp concrete wall, permanently neutralized. The coward who had held my life hostage for 2 grueling years was erased from the board in a fraction of a second. The crushing, suffocating nightmare was officially over. My hands trembled over the keyboard, but not from fear. It was the overwhelming, intoxicating realization that my own intellect, paired with his absolute power, had orchestrated this flawless victory. Dante did not linger over the body. He holstered his weapon smoothly, his broad shoulders dropping slightly as the adrenaline of the execution began to fade, leaving the heavy toll of his own physical injuries behind. He looked up, his slate-gray eyes finding the small security camera mounted in the corner of the room. He stared directly into the lens, piercing through the digital barrier to connect with me sitting in the safe house. "It's done, Clara," Dante murmured into his comms, his voice carrying a deep, exhausting warmth that settled directly into the center of my chest. "You are free. Pack the medical transport. We are taking Martha to the Berkshires." 4 hours later, the pale, freezing blue light of dawn began to crack over the horizon, chasing away the violent darkness of the longest night of my life. Julian's residential safe house had been thoroughly sterilized by the secondary cleanup crews. The shattered front door was temporarily boarded with heavy steel plating, and the white drywall dust was swept away. The Syndicate Private Medical Transport Division idled quietly in the attached garage, the heavy diesel engine humming a low, reassuring rhythm. Dante had returned from the harbor compound looking utterly drained, his face pale and drawn, fresh blood slowly seeping through the edges of his abdominal bandages. His heavy tactical jacket was stained dark with his own blood, the sharp metallic scent of copper mingling with his signature winter cedar. Yet, he vehemently refused the medic's desperate pleas to transport him to the Syndicate's underground surgical ward. He had stubbornly positioned himself in the passenger seat of the armored medical transport, insisted that he would personally oversee the final leg of our journey. I sat in the back of the spacious, ICU-equipped cabin, the heavy tactical sweater providing a cocoon of much-needed warmth. Martha Mercer lay peacefully on the stabilized gurney beside me, her telemetry leads perfectly synchronized with the heavy-duty stationary monitors bolted to the aluminum walls. Her heart rate was steady, her oxygen saturation flawless. Silas Thorne climbed into the driver's seat, pulling the heavy door shut with an airtight thud. The massive enforcer glanced at me through the reinforced plexiglass partition, offering a brief, deeply respectful nod, an acknowledgement that I had completely transcended the role of executive secretary. I had orchestrated a war, directed a tactical raid, and claimed my place beside the dawn. The ambulance pulled smoothly out of the cul-de-sac, merging onto the empty frost-covered highway leading west. The 2-hour drive was incredibly quiet, characterized by the gentle hum of the tires against the wet asphalt and the rhythmic, synthetic beeping of my mother's heart monitor. I stared out the tinted rear windows, watching the dense, suffocating concrete architecture of Boston slowly give way to the sprawling, snow-dusted pine forests of the Massachusetts countryside. The transition of geography mirrored the profound, structural shift in my own psychology. I was leaving behind the cold, hyper-vigilant exhaustion of the city, the crippling debt, the constant fear of Victor's shadow, the desperate need to remain invisible. I had spent 2 years hiding behind an oversized coat and a fake smile, terrified of making a single mistake. Now, I was riding in the back of an armored vault, flanked by the deadliest men on the East Coast, my mother's life finally secured by the very power that had once terrified me. We were climbing higher into the mountains, entering a world of absolute, untouchable security. When the transport finally turned onto a private winding access road, the private care facility in the Berkshires came into view. It did not look like a hospital. It resembled a sprawling, ultra-luxurious alpine resort, constructed from heavy timber, natural stone, and massive panels of insulated, mirrored glass reflecting the pale morning light. It was surrounded by an impenetrable perimeter of wrought iron fencing, and discreet, heavily armed private security personnel monitoring the main gates. This was the sanctuary Julian had secured using the forensic invoice I had demanded. This was the fortress where patients with massive, syndicate-level funding vanished from the public registry, shielded from state boards, legal proxies, and the harsh realities of the standard healthcare system. The ambulance pulled directly into a heated, subterranean receiving bay. A team of discreet, highly professional trauma nurses and a board-certified respiratory specialist were already waiting, perfectly briefed on Martha's complex autoimmune requirements. I stepped out of the back of the transport, the crisp, freezing mountain air stinging my cheeks, devoid of the city's exhaust and pollution. The medical team seamlessly transferred my mother's gurney onto their own advanced telemetry systems, bypassing the standard bureaucratic intake procedures entirely. There were no insurance cards to scan. There were no forms demanding Victor's proxy signature. The financial ledgers were flawlessly balanced. Miss Mercer, the lead administrator, a polished woman in a tailored gray suit, approached me with a warm, highly professional smile. She handed me a sleek leather folio containing the intake documents. Your mother has been assigned to the premier corner suite in the respiratory wing. It overlooks the valley. Her specialized infusion protocol is already prepped. The offshore deposit covered the entirety of her projected care for the next 5 years, and Mr. Alarico has personally secured a perpetual endowment to guarantee her placement. I took the folio, my fingers tracing the smooth, expensive leather. 5 years. The sheer, astronomical volume of that financial commitment was staggering. I had spent 2 years agonizing over $89,000, starving myself and shivering in cheap coats, just to keep the machines running. Dante had not just paid the immediate debt. He had built a permanent, impenetrable financial fortress around her life. I looked back toward the armored ambulance. Dante had finally allowed Silas to help him out of the passenger seat. The mafia boss stood near the heavy reinforced doors, his posture slightly hunched to protect his torn abdomen, but his slate-gray eyes were locked unwaveringly on me. He looked exhausted, bloodied, and magnificent. Silas walked over to me, stopping a respectful distance away. The massive driver looked down at the leather folio in my hands. He burned his own rules for you, Clara, Silas murmured, his deep, gravelly voice carrying a profound sincerity. He abandoned a cartel summit, destroyed his own communications array, and took a bullet meant for your family. He doesn't just want to protect you. He wants to give you the entire world, exactly on your terms. I nodded, the final remnants of my defensive, independent armor fracturing. I didn't need to fight this battle alone anymore. I walked past the administrator, crossing the polished concrete of the receiving bay, and stopped directly in front of Dante. He looked down at me, the harsh, predatory lines of his face softening into an expression of raw, unvarnished devotion. Is she secure? He asked quietly, his voice raspy from the long, violent night. She is completely safe, I whispered, the crushing weight of the last 2 years lifting from my shoulders. The somatic relief was absolute, a warm, golden wave washing through my exhausted body, bringing tears to my eyes. Not of terror, but of profound, overwhelming peace. Victor is gone. The proxy is broken. I don't owe anyone anything. Dante reached out with his uninjured hand, his warm, calloused fingers gently cupping my jaw. The cool metal of his crest pressed against my skin, no longer a symbol of a gilded cage, but a badge of absolute sovereign partnership. You never did, Clara, Dante murmured, leaning down to press a slow, lingering kiss against my forehead, breathing in the scent of my hair. You earned every piece of this sanctuary. Now, let the doctors do their job. It is time for us to go home.